Ability. Metal memory. Recall the properties of metals and alloys after a single use. Forge familiarity. Reduced fatigue and increased focus when working near a forge. Level 2650, Journeyman of Steel. Edge Whisperer. Blades crafted by you retain sharpness longer and resist chipping. Armor Fit. Armor forged by you molds more naturally to the wearer's body. Temper Mastery. Gain the ability to fine-tune hardness and flexibility in forged items. Rune Etching, locked. Begin inscribing minor magical runes into weapons and armor. Level 5175, Master of Flame and Form. Soul Steel Bond. Weapons forged by you can be attuned to a specific wielder, increasing their effectiveness. Echo Forge. Replicate any weapon or armor you've seen once with near-perfect accuracy. Elemental Alloying, locked. Combine magical elements with metal to create hybrid materials. Forge of the North. When working in the north, your creations gain increased durability and resistance to cold. Level 76-100, Forge Master of the Old Blood. Living Steel. Create weapons that subtly adapt to their wielder's style over time. Star-forged. Craft items using rare celestial metals, for example, meteoric iron, starstone. Legacy Smith. Your creations gain names and reputations of their own. Mythmaker's Hand, locked. Create legendary weapons and armor akin to those from the Age of Heroes. Master Perk, Song of Smoke and Steel. Status, locked. Requirement. You have glimpsed the secrets of the forge, but the true fire lies deeper still. Unlock the lost art of Valyrian steel, folded flame, frozen fire, and magic bound in metal. With this mastery, you may craft weapons and armor of unparalleled sharpness, resilience, and beauty, each piece a legacy, each blade a song. Perk effects. Upon unlock, gain the ability to forge and reforge Valyrian steel weapons and armor. Unlock access to ancient forging techniques, including blood binding, dragon flame tempering, and rune weaving. Crafted items gain unique magical properties and may develop sentience or memory over time. Each creation becomes a named artifact, recorded in the annals of the interface and known to the world. Note: the requirement to unlock this perk is hidden. It may involve bloodline, magic, lost knowledge, or a trial yet to come. Arthur stared at the glowing text, his breath caught in his throat. Valyrian steel. He tapped the panel again, but the interface offered nothing more. No hint. No clue. Just the soft shimmer of potential waiting to be earned. Arthur closed the tab slowly, the firelight flickering across his face. He would find the key. Whatever it was. The nursery door creaked open with its usual soft groan, and Arthur didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of lavender and citrus drifted in before her, followed by the gentle rustle of fabric and the unmistakable presence of his mother. His mother stepped into the room, her violet eyes immediately landing on her son, already awake, already sitting upright in bed, the blanket draped neatly around his waist like a miniature Lord of Winterfell. She raised a single, elegant eyebrow. "You're up early." Arthur blinked once, the interface still flickering faintly in the corner of his vision. A new notification had just appeared, glowing softly in a pale pink hue. Family update: Ashura Dane status, pregnant, 1 month, estimated due date, 8 months. Child status, confirmed. Viable relationship threads, pending. Arthur's eyes widened slightly. He turned his head slowly to look at her, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and exasperation. Ashura crossed the room with her usual grace and sat beside him on the bed, brushing a hand through his hair. "You're staring," she said lightly. "Why are you staring?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He was still doing the math in his head. He and Samuel were 3. John was 2. Sansa and Rob had just turned 1. And now, kid number 6. He raised an incredulous eyebrow at her, his expression a perfect blend of suspicion and dry amusement. Ashura narrowed her eyes playfully. "What is that look?" Arthur tilted his head, lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought was loud enough in his mind. They weren't joking about the dozen. He vaguely remembered Hermione once mentioning that in ancient times, before the Statute of Secrecy, both magical and non-magical families often had 10, 12, even 15 children. Something about legacy, survival, and the strength of bloodlines. Apparently, his parents had taken that philosophy to heart. Ashura smoothed the blanket over his lap, her fingers gentle. "You're thinking something," she said, her voice soft but knowing. Something cheeky. Arthur gave her a look. She gave him one right back. He considered telling her. Just blurting it out, I know you're pregnant again. But then he thought better of it. Let them figure it out. Let them have their moment of surprise. He'd already had his. He leaned against her instead, resting his head lightly against her side. Ashura smiled, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. You're warm this morning, she murmured. And quiet. That usually means you're plotting something. Arthur smirked faintly. Always. She chuckled, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. Well, try not to plot anything too dangerous before breakfast. Arthur closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her presence settle over him like a second blanket. 6, he thought. 5 kids and 1 more on the way. He was going to need a bigger interface. His mother's arm draped gently around his shoulders, her fingers idly brushing through his dark hair. He leaned into her without hesitation, the tension in his small frame slowly unwinding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, Ashura whispered, "Should we wake your brothers?" Arthur shook his head once, slow and deliberate. He didn't lift his head. Instead, he shifted slightly and rested it against her chest, just over her heart. The steady rhythm of it was soothing, familiar in a way that nothing else ever quite was. Ashura smiled faintly, her hand stilling in his hair. "No, I suppose not," she murmured. "They'll wake soon enough." Arthur didn't answer. It had been too long since he'd had her to himself. Too many days filled with lessons, with siblings, with the quiet weight of expectations. His mother was always there, but rarely just for him. There was always someone else needing her attention, John with his quiet questions, Samuel with his endless energy, the twins with their cries and coos. But now, for this moment, she was his. Ashura tilted her head slightly, resting her cheek against the top of his head. "You've grown," she whispered. "Not just taller. Quieter. Stronger." Arthur's eyes fluttered closed. "I miss this," she said softly. "When it was just you and me. Before the world got so loud." Arthur's fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her robe, and she felt the smallest knot against her chest. She smiled faintly, her lips brushing the crown of his head. "One day," she whispered, "you'll have to tell me what's going on in that clever little head of yours." Arthur didn't respond, but she felt the subtle shift of his shoulders, the way his breath caught just slightly. He'd heard her. He always did. She kissed his hair, soft and slow. "You're too smart for your own good sometimes," she murmured, her voice a blend of pride and quiet exasperation. "I can see it in your eyes. Always thinking. Always watching." Arthur's fingers twitched slightly, but he didn't lift his head. He just pressed a little closer, as if to say, "Not yet. Not today." Ashura chuckled under her breath, the sound low and warm. "Fine," she said softly. "Keep your secrets for now." She leaned back slightly, adjusting the blanket around him, her hand never leaving his back. "But when you're ready," she added, "I'll be here. Always." Arthur didn't speak. The peace of the nursery was broken by a soft rustle and a muffled yawn. Samuel stirred beneath his blanket, blinking blearily up at the ceiling. His curls were a tousled mess, and one sock had somehow ended up on his hand instead of his foot. He rubbed his eyes with a chubby fist, then turned his head, and grinned. There, nestled against their mother, was Arthur, half asleep and entirely content. Ashura sat with her back against the headboard, one arm wrapped around Arthur, her other hand still gently stroking his hair. Samuel's grin widened. Without a word, he reached for the nearest object, his wooden direwolf, and lobbed it across the room with all the precision of a sleepy toddler. The toy bounced off the edge of John's bed with a soft thunk, landing squarely on the boy's ribs. John jolted upright, eyes wide, hair sticking up in every direction. He looked around wildly, as if expecting an ambush. Ashura sighed, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Samuel Stark." Samuel giggled and scrambled out of bed, dragging his blanket behind him like a cape. "Sorry, Mama," he said, not sounding sorry at all. He clambered up onto the bed with practiced ease and flopped into Ashura's lap beside Arthur, wrapping his arms around his brother's middle and resting his cheek against his shoulder. Arthur grunted softly but didn't protest. He leaned into the embrace. John, now fully awake, blinked at them from across the room. Then, without a word, he padded over and climbed onto the bed as well, curling up on Ashura's other side. He didn't speak, he rarely did, but he nestled close, his small hand resting lightly on her knee. Ashura looked down at the tangle of limbs and sleepy faces in her lap and let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sigh. "You're all getting too big for this," she murmured. "No, we're not," Samwell said, muffled against Arthur's shoulder. Arthur smirked. John closed his eyes. And that was the sight Ned walked in on. He paused in the doorway, one hand still on the latch, his cloak dusted with snow from the courtyard. His grey eyes took in the scene, the three boys curled around their mother like pups around a hearth, Ashura's arms wrapped around them all, her expression soft and tired and full. Ned didn't speak. He simply stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and crossed the room in silence. He knelt beside the bed, brushing a hand through John's hair, then Samwell's, then Arthur's. Ashura looked up at him, her smile quiet and knowing. "They're awake," she said. Ned nodded. "I can see that." Arthur looked up at his father, his violet eyes steady. Ned met his gaze and gave the faintest of smiles. "Room for one more?" he asked. Ashura laughed softly. "You'll break the bed." But she shifted anyway, and Ned sat beside them, the fire crackling behind him, the snow falling softly beyond the windows. And for a little while longer, the world outside could wait. After breakfast, the family made their way through the winding halls of Winterfell, the stone corridors echoing with the soft patter of small boots and the occasional squeal of excitement. Ashura led the way, her violet cloak trailing behind her while John, Samwell, Arthur, and a toddling Robb followed close behind. Sansa, bundled in a thick woolen wrap, was carried by a nursemaid just behind them. The air grew sharper as they stepped into the courtyard, the scent of snow and straw mingling with the distant clang of steel from the training yard. Ashura turned toward the kennels, where the bark of hounds and the low murmur of voices signaled their destination. Farlin, the grizzled hound master, stood near the gate, his thick arms crossed over his chest and his beard dusted with frost. He looked up as they approached, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "Lady Ashura," he said with a respectful nod. "Brought the pups out this morning. Thought the little lords might like a look." Ashura smiled. "They've been asking since the snow melted." Farlin opened the gate, and the children surged forward, John with quiet curiosity, Samwell with a delighted squeal, and Robb toddling after them with wide eyes. Sansa gurgled in the nursemaid's arms, her tiny hands reaching toward the sounds. The puppies were a tangle of fur and clumsy limbs, stumbling over one another in the straw. They yipped and tumbled, their tails wagging furiously as they explored the world with oversized paws and wet noses. Arthur stood back at first, watching. Then he felt it. A pull. A tug in the back of his mind, soft, insistent, like a thread being drawn taut. He turned his head slowly. In the far corner of the kennel, half hidden behind a bale of straw, sat a small, scruffy pup. Its fur was darker than the others, a mottled grey-black, and its eyes, pale, almost silver, were fixed on him. Arthur stared. The pup stared back. And then the world shifted. Suddenly, Arthur wasn't in the kennel anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere vast and strange. The air was thick with scent, rich and wild. Shapes loomed around him, blurry and massive. One of them stepped forward, its form indistinct but towering, its presence immense. It leaned down. Arthur could feel it examining him, watching him. It didn't feel hostile. Just curious. Then it extended something, long and pale, ending in 5 smaller things. A hand. Arthur felt an overwhelming urge to bite it. Not out of fear. Out of instinct. He opened his mouth and tried to bite, only to realize he had no teeth. And then... "Arthur!" His mother's voice snapped him back. He blinked. He was in the kennel again. The pup was in front of him now, its tiny jaws clamped gently around his finger, gumming at it with toothless determination. Ashura knelt beside him, her brow furrowed. "Arthur, are you all right?" Farlin stepped closer, peering down at the pup. "That one," he muttered. "Didn't think he'd last the week. Runt of the litter. barely eats. Sleeps more than he should. Arthur's eyes widened in horror. He looked down at the pup, who was still nibbling on his finger, its eyes locked on his. A soft chime echoed in his mind. New tray unlocked, Warg. You have formed your first animal bond. Species, Northern Wolfhound. Bond strength, level 1/10. Status, runt weak but resilient. Affinity, high. This creature is now linked to your spirit. Growth will be shared. Fate will be entwined. Arthur's breath caught. He scooped the pup into his arms, cradling it gently against his chest. Ashura blinked. Arthur. He looked up at her, his voice quiet but certain. He's mine. Ashura's brow furrowed as she looked down at the tiny bundle of fur nestled in Arthur's arms. The pup was barely larger than a loaf of bread, its limbs thin, its ears too big for its head. It blinked up at her with pale, watery eyes, still gumming softly at Arthur's sleeve. Arthur, she said gently, crouching beside him, are you sure? He's very small. Arthur nodded without hesitation, his arms tightening protectively around the pup. He's mine. Ashura glanced at Falin, who stood just behind the kennel gate, arms crossed and expression unreadable. The hound master scratched at his beard. There's plenty of pups, my lady, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Strong ones. Healthy. If the little lords and lady want one, they've their pick of the litter. He gestured toward the rest of the pups, who were still tumbling over one another in the straw, fat, bright-eyed, and full of energy. But that one, Falin's gaze drifted back to the runt in Arthur's arms. He's the smallest I've seen in years. Weak lungs. I don't think he can see that well. Ashura's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked back at Arthur, her expression softening. There's no shame in choosing another pup, sweeterling. One that's strong and can keep up with you. Arthur shook his head, his violet eyes steady. I want this one. Falin frowned, stepping closer. He might not make it through the next moon, lad. You sure? Arthur looked up at him, his voice quiet but firm. He's mine. The pup let out a soft, wheezy yip, as if in agreement, and nestled deeper into Arthur's arms. Falin sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Well. I suppose if he's going to have a chance, better it be with someone who won't let go. Ashura studied her son for a long moment. There was something in his expression, something older than 3 years, something resolute. She'd seen that look before. In Ned, when he made a decision he wouldn't be moved from. In her brother Arthur when he stood with sword in hand and refused to yield. She exhaled softly. All right, she said. But you'll be responsible for him. Feeding him. Keeping him warm. Making sure he grows. Arthur nodded solemnly. Ashura reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. Then he's yours. Falin gave a grunt of reluctant approval. I'll have a blanket and a feeding bowl sent to the little lord's room. And some broth. He'll need it. Arthur looked down at the pup, who was now dozing in his arms, its breath shallow but steady. I want one too. Samwell blurted, nearly tripping over his own feet as he spun toward the straw-scattered pen. That one. No, wait. That one. Rob, not to be outdone, let out a delighted squeal and toddled after him, pointing with both hands at a chubby, golden-furred pup that was currently chewing on a piece of rope twice its size. Puppy. John, who had been watching quietly from the side, stepped forward with a more measured pace, but his eyes were locked on a sleek, dark-coated pup with a white streak down its nose. He didn't say anything, but the way he crouched beside it, hand outstretched, made it clear, he'd already chosen. Even Sansa, still in the nursemaid's arms, began to squirm and babble excitedly, her tiny hands reaching toward the pen. Puh. Puh. Ashura blinked, momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden chorus of demands. Samwell was already halfway into the pen, arms outstretched as he tried to catch a particularly fast little pup that darted between his legs with a yip. Come back. You're mine. Rob had plopped down in the straw and was now hugging the golden pup around the neck, both of them rolling in a tangle of limbs and laughter. John sat cross-legged, the dark pup curled in his lap, licking his fingers with quiet devotion. Even Sangza had managed to wriggle free from the nursemaid's arms and was now toddling toward a tiny white furred pup that blinked up at her with sleepy eyes. Ashura looked around at the chaos, her children scattered across the kennel, each one bonding with a pup in their own way, and shook her head with a soft laugh. "Well," she said, glancing at Falin, "I suppose we'll need more blankets." Arthur, still holding the runt close, watched his siblings with a faint smile. The bond in his mind pulsed gently, warm and steady. He looked down at the pup in his arms, who blinked up at him with sleepy eyes and gave a soft, toothless yawn. Notification: sibling bonds detected. Puppy selection in progress. Potential pack formation: Northern Wolfhounds status: forming unique trait unlocked. Pack born when bonded siblings and their pups are together, gain plus 5% morale, plus 3% coordination, and plus 2% magical sensitivity. Arthur's eyes widened slightly. Did his siblings experience the same thing he did? Ned stepped through the heavy doors, brushing snow from his shoulders, his cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. He paused mid-step. At the center of the hall, seated on furs and cushions scattered across the floor, were all 5 of his children, each one cradling a puppy. Arthur sat cross-legged, the runt nestled against his chest, its tiny head tucked beneath his chin. John was beside him, his dark-furred pup curled in his lap, both of them still and watchful. Samuel was giggling as his pup licked his face, the boy's arms wrapped tightly around its plump body. Rob was lying on his back, his golden-furred companion sprawled across his stomach, both of them panting from some recent tumble. And Sangza, barely toddling, sat with her legs splayed out, her white-furred pup dozing in her lap as she patted its head with surprising gentleness. Ned raised an eyebrow. Ashura stood near the hearth, her arms folded, a faint smile playing at her lips. She turned as he approached, her violet eyes gleaming with amusement. "I leave for half a day," Ned said dryly, "and return to find the great hall overrun by hounds." Ashura chuckled softly. "Puppies, technically." Ned glanced at the children again. "That's not better." "They're happy," she said, her voice warm. "And bonded, I think. Especially Arthur." Ned's gaze shifted to his second son, who hadn't moved since he entered. The pup in his arms was barely breathing, but Arthur held it with a quiet intensity, his eyes distant, as if still half elsewhere. Ashura stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Something happened at the kennels." Ned turned to her, his expression sharpening. He was staring at one of the pups, the runt. Wouldn't look away. Then he just froze. Like he wasn't here anymore. His eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing us. Ned's jaw tightened. "How long?" "Only a few seconds," she said. "But when I called his name, he blinked and looked at me like he'd just woken from a dream. And the pup was nibbling on his finger." Ned looked back at Arthur, who now gently stroked the pup's back with one hand, his other resting protectively over its tiny ribs. "He said it was his," Ashura continued. "Refused to pick another. Falin and I tried to talk him out of it, but Arthur wouldn't budge." Ned was silent for a long moment as his gaze lingered on the boy and the runt in his arms. The firelight flickered across Arthur's face, casting shadows beneath his eyes, and for a moment, Ned saw not a child, but a figure standing in snow and silence, with a blade in one hand and several animals around him. He blinked the vision away. "They'll need training," he said at last. "The pups. The children." Ashura smiled faintly. "Then we'll help them." Ned nodded once, then stepped forward, his boots echoing softly on the stone. Arthur looked up as he approached, his violet eyes clear now, focused. Ned knelt beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. Ned knelt beside his son, his hand resting gently on Arthur's small shoulder. The boy looked up at him, violet eyes steady, the tiny pup still nestled against his chest. The runt blinked sleepily, its pale eyes half-lidded, its breath shallow but even. "What's his name?" Ned asked, his voice low and even. Arthur looked down at the pup again, his fingers brushing through its scruffy fur. The bond between them pulsed faintly in his mind, warm, fragile, but growing stronger with every heartbeat. He could feel the pup's presence like a second heartbeat, a flicker of instinct and emotion just beneath the surface. The others had already named theirs. Samuel had proudly declared his pup Mutton, much to Falin's dismay. John had whispered something about Bone, though he hadn't said it loud enough for anyone else to hear. Rob had gone with Barky, which made Sansa giggle until she named her Snowdrop. But Arthur had waited. He hadn't wanted to rush it. He'd been listening. And now, as he looked into the pup's pale eyes, something stirred in the back of his mind, a memory not quite his, a name whispered in a voice that echoed with laughter and mischief and loyalty. A name that felt like home. Arthur smiled faintly. Padfoot, he said. Ned raised an eyebrow. Padfoot. Arthur nodded, his voice firmer now. That's his name. The pup gave a soft, breathy yip, as if in agreement, and nestled deeper into Arthur's arms. Ashura, watching from nearby, tilted her head with a curious smile. It suits him. The fire in Ned's study burned low, casting long shadows across the stone walls and the heavy oak desk cluttered with parchment, ink pots, and a growing stack of old books. The room smelled of leather, pine smoke, and the faint metallic tang of cold steel, his sword, ice, resting in its stand near the hearth. Ned sat hunched over the desk, his brow furrowed, fingers stained with ink as he flipped through the brittle pages of a cracked leather-bound tome. The candlelight flickered across the worn title embossed on the cover. Of Skin Changers and the Sight, a study of the old blood. He hadn't meant to fall so deep into the lore. But ever since Ashura had told him what happened at the kennels, Arthur's trance, the way the runt had bonded to him, the way he'd spoken of the pup as if it had chosen him, something had stirred in Ned's memory. A whisper from the crypts. A shadow from the past. He turned another page, eyes scanning the faded ink. The bond between a warg and their beast is not merely affection. It is a tether of spirit, forged in instinct and blood. The younger the bond is formed, the deeper it roots. In rare cases, the beast and the child grow as one, mirroring each other's strength, pain, and even thought. Ned exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He reached for another book, this one older, its pages yellowed and brittle. A Stark family chronicle, copied by Maestas long dead. He flipped to the section on the Age of Heroes, his fingers pausing on a familiar name. Warg King's Daughters. The ink beneath the name was faded, but legible. The blood of the Warg King runs through the veins of House Stark. His daughters were said to speak with wolves, and their sons to ride the minds of beasts. Though the gift waned over time, it never vanished. In every generation, one or two would dream with the eyes of animals, or wake with the scent of snow and fur in their lungs. Ned leaned back in his chair, the firelight dancing across his face. He remembered the old stories old Nan used to tell, of Starks who vanished into the woods for days, only to return with the eyes of wolves. Of lords who dreamed of the hunt and woke with blood beneath their nails. He'd always thought them just that, stories. But now he wasn't so sure. He turned to another book, this one a Maestas field journal from the north. The page he landed on was marked with a charcoal sketch of a boy and a wolf pup curled together, their eyes closed, their breathing in perfect sync. Signs of early warging include prolonged eye contact with animals, trance-like states, shared dreams, and instinctive understanding of a creature's needs. The bond often begins with a single beast, but may expand with age and strength of will. Ned's jaw tightened. Ned turned another page, the parchment crackling softly beneath his fingers. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing coals, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the inked words before him, each line deepening the weight in his chest. The ability begins as dreams, vivid, immersive, and often mistaken for imagination. The warg sees through the eyes of the beast, hears what it hears, smells what it smells. These dreams are not symbolic, they are real. The warg's spirit rides the animal's senses, tethered by instinct and blood. Ned's fingers tightened around the edge of the page. With time and practice, the warg may learn to enter the mind of the beast at will. When this occurs, the warg's human body becomes comatose, eyes glazed white, breath shallow, limbs slack. The spirit is absent, riding the beast. Only upon return does the body stir again. He exhaled slowly, the image forming in his mind, Arthur, small and still, his eyes pale and empty while his mind ran through the snow on four legs. Warging is distinct from the sight. The sight allows glimpses of past or future events, often through dreams or visions. Some rare individuals possess both gifts, though the two are not inherently linked. Ned's brow furrowed. He thought of Arthur's stillness at the kennels. The way he'd described the sensation afterward, like something vast and strange had examined him. That hadn't sounded like a dream. It had sounded like a crossing. Walks cannot easily enter the minds of other humans. The human mind resists intrusion, and the attempt often results in madness or death. Few even try. Ned turned the page, his breath catching slightly at the next passage. The bond between a walk and their beast is not merely spiritual, it is temporal. The beast's life is extended, sometimes unnaturally so. There are tales of wolves, hawks, and even bears that lived for decades, their bodies sustained by the presence of their bonded walk. These beasts often die only when their walk dies of old age. It is said that some walks can command over a dozen animals at once, though this is thought to be very dangerous for the walk as it could lose their humanity. He sat back in his chair, the book resting open in his lap. Arthur's pup, Padfoot, was the runt. Weak. Fragile. Not expected to survive the week. And yet, since the bond had formed, the pup had grown stronger. More alert. More present. Ned stared into the dying fire, the words echoing in his mind. The beast lives as long as the walk. He closed the book slowly, the leather cover soft beneath his calloused fingers. This was no passing fancy. No childhood whim. Arthur had awakened something ancient. Something dangerous. And Ned would have to guide him through it. He sat in silence for a long moment, the fire's glow flickering across the stone walls of his study, the book still open in his lap. The words he'd just read echoed in his mind, but it wasn't only Arthur he was thinking of now. It was John, how the boy had sat so still beside his dark-furred pup, the two of them mirroring each other's quiet watchfulness. It was Samuel, how his laughter had turned to fierce protectiveness the moment someone else reached for his chosen pup. It was Rob, how he'd rolled in the straw with his golden-furred companion like they'd known each other for years. And even Sansa, barely walking, but already cradling her white-furred pup with a gentleness that seemed instinctive, almost reverent. At first, Ned had dismissed it as the innocent joy of children. The thrill of new companions. The novelty of soft fur and wagging tails. But now he wasn't so sure. The bond Arthur had formed was undeniable. And if the old texts were right, if the blood of the Walk King still ran in the veins of House Stark, then perhaps Arthur wasn't the only one awakening. Perhaps the pack was larger than he thought. Ned stood abruptly, the chair scraping softly against the stone floor. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling open a drawer in his desk and retrieving a fresh sheet of parchment, a quill, and a small pot of ink. He dipped the quill and began to write, his script swift and precise. To Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch. My old friend. I write to you not as Warden of the North, but as a father with questions I can no longer ignore. You once told me, long ago, that the old blood still lingers in the neck, that walks and green seers walk your swamps, hidden from the eyes of the South. I listened then with half a heart, too burdened by war and duty to truly hear you. I hear you now. My children have bonded with wolfhounds. Not just as pets, but as something deeper. Arthur, he is the clearest sign. He entered a trance and said the pup chose him. I believe he has awakened the gift. And I fear he may not be alone. If you know anything, if there are teachings, warnings, or truths I should understand, send them. Or better yet, come yourself. I trust no one else with this. The old blood is stirring in Winterfell. And I would not see it rise without guidance. Eddard Stark. He stopped first at the boys' room first. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, the scent of lavender and warm wool drifting out to greet him. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft orange glow across the room. Samuel and Arthur lay in their beds, the covers pulled up to their chins, their faces peaceful in sleep. At the foot of Samuel's bed, curled into a tight ball, was his pup, Mutton, snoring softly, his round belly rising and falling with each breath. One of Samuel's hands dangled over the edge of the bed, resting lightly on the pup's back. Arthur's bed was neater, more composed. The runt, Padfoot, lay nestled against his side, his tiny body tucked beneath Arthur's arm. The boy's hand rested protectively over the pup's ribs, even in sleep. Their breathing was synchronized, slow and steady, as if they shared the same rhythm. John lay on his side, facing the wall, his dark hair tousled across the pillow. At his back, pressed close and still as a shadow, was his pup, Bone. The name suited him, his pale eyes open even in the dark. They flicked toward Ned as he entered, but the pup didn't move. He simply watched, as if he understood. Ned watched them for a long moment, his jaw tight as his breath caught. He turned and made his way to the nursery where the twins slept. Rob was sprawled across his cradle, one arm flung over his head, the other wrapped around the golden-furred pup that lay across his chest. The pup's tail thumped once in its sleep, responding to some dream only it could see. Sansa, in her cradle, slept with her white-furred pup curled beside her, its head resting on her tiny shoulder. The nursemaid had tried to separate them earlier, Ashura had said, but the pup had howled until it was returned. Now, both girl and pup slept in perfect peace, their bodies pressed close, their bond already unshakable. Ned stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. 5 children. 5 pups. This was no coincidence. Ned pushed open the door to his chambers with a quiet hand, the iron latch clicking softly behind him. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting a warm, flickering glow across the stone walls and the thick furs draped over the bed. Ashura stirred beneath the covers, propping herself up on one elbow. Her hair spilled across the pillows like ink, her violet eyes catching the firelight as she watched him. "You've been in your study since dinner," she said softly. "You didn't even come to say goodnight." Ned didn't answer at first. He removed his cloak and sword belt with slow, deliberate movements, then crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. Ashura sat up straighter, concern blooming in her voice. "Ned, what is it? What's wrong?" He turned to her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those grey, storm-worn eyes, were heavy with thought. "Do you know what a warg is?" he asked quietly. Ashura blinked. "A what?" "A warg," he repeated. "It's an old word. Northern. From before the Andals came. It means someone who can enter the mind of an animal. See through its eyes. Feel what it feels." Ashura frowned, confused. "Like magic?" Ned nodded. "Old magic. The kind that runs in blood and bone. The kind that's mostly faded now, except in stories. And in the neck." Ashura tilted her head. "Is this what you've been reading about?" He reached for the folded parchment on the nightstand, a page from one of the books he'd copied by hand, and handed it to her. "I've been reading everything I could find," he said. "Old Maestus journals. Stark family records. Accounts from the Age of Heroes. And what I've found, it all points to the same thing." Ashura scanned the page, her brow furrowing. "Dreams, entering the minds of animals, comatose bodies." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "You think Arthur?" "I know Arthur," Ned said. "But I don't think it's just him." He stood and began to pace slowly, his voice low and steady. "At first, I thought it was just children being children. A litter of pups, a bit of excitement. But the way they bonded, so quickly, so deeply, it's not normal. I saw them tonight. All of them. Sleeping beside their pups like they were part of the same breath. Bone was awake, watching me. Padfoot was curled into Arthur like they shared a heartbeat. Even Sansa's pup wouldn't leave her cradle." Ashura's lips parted, but no words came. Ned continued. "Arthur went into a trance when he met Padfoot. Ashura, you said it yourself, it was like he wasn't there. His eyes were open, but he was somewhere else. And when he came back, the pup was nibbling on his finger like it had known him forever." Ashura placed a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with realization. "I've written to Howland Reed," Ned said. "He told me once that the old blood still lingers in the neck. That there are still wargs and green seers in his swamps. I didn't believe him then. I do now." Ashura looked down at the parchment in her hands, then back at her husband. "And if he's right?" Ned met her gaze, his voice quiet but resolute. "Then we're not just raising children. We're raising something older. Wilder. The North is waking, Ashura. And our children are part of it." Chapter 5, Mayra. Chapter text. Arthur sat cross-legged atop his own, the blanket pulled around his waist. His posture was straight, his expression calm, but his eyes were fixed on the shimmering interface only he could see. Padfoot lay curled in his lap, no longer the frail, trembling runt he had once been. Weeks of warmth, food, and the quiet strength of their bond had transformed him. His limbs were sturdier, his coat thicker, and his breath came strong and steady. He still wasn't the largest of the pups, but he was alert now, watchful. His pale eyes blinked up at Arthur with quiet intelligence, and his tail gave a soft thump against the boy's leg. Arthur reached down and scratched behind his ears, his other hand navigating the glowing tree that had unfolded before him. Walk skill tree status, active bonded beast, Padfoot, Northern Wolfhound, bond level, 2/10 XP, 2180/6000 perk points available, 1. Each level required more experience than the last. He'd learned that quickly. The first level had come easily, just the act of bonding had been enough. But now, the climb was steeper. Level 3 would require 6000 XP. Level 4 8000. And the final level, level 10, would demand a staggering 20,000 XP. But the rewards. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he studied the tree. Each level offered 2 distinct perks, but only one could be chosen. Bond Level 1 Initiate. Dreamwalker, chosen, unlocks vivid dreams through the bonded beast's senses. Dreams become clearer with time. Beast Empathy, locked. Bond Level 2 Rooted. Shared Instincts, available, gain minor boosts to perception and reflexes when near bonded beast. Silent Tongue, available, unlocks a rudimentary form of nonverbal communication with bonded beast. Arthur hovered over both. Shared Instincts was practical, useful in combat, in training and in survival. But Silent Tongue, that was tempting to him. He glanced down at Padfoot, who blinked up at him, ears twitching. Arthur selected Silent Tongue. Perk unlocked, Silent Tongue +1 relationship, Padfoot, +5% bond XP gain, passive, bond level, 2/10 XP. 2180/6000 2480/6000. Padfoot gave a soft huff, and Arthur felt it, not just the sound, but the intent behind it. A flicker of amusement. A sleepy sort of satisfaction. Arthur smiled faintly. The tree shimmered again, revealing the next tier, still locked, but visible. Bond level 3 deepening. XP required, 9000 perk choices, preview. Beast Echo temporarily mimic one physical trait of your bonded beast, for example, hearing, smell. Echo Pulse sense the emotional state of your bonded beast across any distance. Bond level 4 harmonized. XP required, 12,000 perk choices, preview. Reflex link when in danger, gain a brief surge of speed or agility if bonded beast reacts first. Shared Hunger increased stamina and focus when hunting or tracking together. Bond level 5 threshold. XP required, 15,000 unlocks second bond slot. Pack Whisperer, preview, minor influence over other canines. Split Sight, preview, briefly see through both bonded beasts at once. Bond level 6 resonance. XP required, 18,000. Shared Pulse, preview, when one bonded beast is injured, gain a temporary boost to strength and awareness. Beast's Grace, preview, gain passive agility and balance bonuses when moving with your bonded beast. Bond level 7 Deep Bond. XP required, 21,000. Instinctive Dodge, preview, gain a chance to evade danger based on your beast's reflexes. Mental Merge, preview, briefly share thoughts and images with your bonded beast. Bond level 8 Wild Unity. XP required, 24,000. Pack Reflex, preview, when fighting alongside bonded beasts, gain increased coordination and reaction speed. Beast's Endurance, preview, gain resistance to fatigue and cold when near bonded beasts. Bond level 9 Spirit Tethered. XP required, 27,000. Soul Recall, preview, if a bonded beast is slain, you may attempt to restore it once per lifetime. Echo of the Wild, preview, gain a passive aura that calms nearby animals and unsettles hostile ones. Bond level 10 Apex. XP required, 30,000 unlocks third and fourth bond slots. Beast Lord's Mantle, preview, gain passive bonuses from all bonded beasts simultaneously. Soul Merge, preview, once per moon, fully merge with a bonded beast, gaining its form and instincts. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he focused on the locked perks. Beast Echo would be useful in the field, tracking, sensing danger. But Echo Pulse offered something more subtle, awareness, even when apart. He marked it mentally as a contender. Reflex Link felt like a survival tool, one that could save his life. Shed Hunger was more situational. He leaned toward Reflex Link when the time came. The reward for hitting level 5 caught his attention also. A second bond. Another creature, another mind. He imagined it, a hawk, a shadow cat, a direwolf. The possibilities were endless. Split Sight would be powerful also. He marked Split Sight. Shed Pulse was reactive, powerful, but only in pain. Beast's Grace was constant. He favored Grace. Mental Merge was a no-brainer either. He was leaning towards SPAC Reflex also. Soul Recall was a no-brainer either. He didn't know what to pick for when he hit level 10, both perks were powerful at the moment. The door creaked open the next second, and Arthur looked up from his bed just as his mother stepped inside. Ashura's violet eyes softened when they met his, though her tone carried a note of formality. "Your father wishes to see you in his study," she said gently. "Now?" Arthur nodded, already sliding off the bed. Padfoot stirred from his nap and immediately scrambled to his feet, tail wagging furiously. The pup gave a happy yip and trotted beside Arthur, his paws still a little too big for his legs, making each step a determined bounce. Ashura smiled faintly at the sight but said nothing as they walked together through the stone corridors of Winterfell. The torches lining the walls flickered in the morning light, and the castle was quiet, save for the soft patter of Padfoot's paws and the occasional yip as he struggled to keep pace, especially when they reached the stairs. Arthur paused at the base of the spiral steps, glancing down at his pup. "You can do it," he whispered. Padfoot gave a determined bark and began climbing, one paw at a time, tail wagging the entire time. When they reached the study, Ashura knocked once before opening the heavy oak door. Inside, the fire was lit, casting a warm glow over the stone walls and the shelves lined with old tomes and scrolls. His father stood behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. But Arthur's eyes were drawn to the two strangers standing beside him. One was a small man, so small Arthur nearly mistook him for a boy. He had sharp eyes, a weathered face, and a quiet stillness that reminded Arthur of the Godswood. The other was a woman with dark hair braided down her back, a leather falconer's glove on one arm. Perched on it was a hawk, its golden eyes alert and unblinking. Ned gestured to the chair in front of the desk. "Arthur. Sit." Arthur obeyed, Padfoot curling up at his feet with a soft huff. "These are friends of mine," Ned said. "From the neck. They've come a long way to speak with you." Arthur glanced at the two strangers, then back at his father. "I want you to tell them what happened," Ned said. "The first time you saw Padfoot." "Everything." Arthur hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. He closed his eyes, drawing the memory forward like a thread from the past. "When I stepped into the kennel I felt it," he began quietly. "A pull. A tug in the back of my mind, soft, but strong. Like something was calling me." He opened his eyes, staring past the firelight. I turned my head. And in the far corner of the kennel, behind a bale of straw, there was Padfoot. Small. Scruffy. His fur was darker than the others, and his eyes, they were pale. Almost silver. He was staring at me. Arthur's voice dropped lower. I stared back. And then, the world shifted. The room was silent. I wasn't in the kennel anymore. I was somewhere else. Vast. Strange. The air was thick with strange smells. There were shapes around me. Big ones. Blurry. One of them stepped forward. It was huge. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me. Curious but not dangerous. Arthur's fingers curled slightly in his lap. It leaned down. And it held something out. A hand. Long and pale, with 5 fingers. He looked down at Padfoot, who was now watching him intently. I wanted to bite it. Not because I was scared. Because I was supposed to. Like it was part of something. Arthur's voice softened. I opened my mouth. But I didn't have teeth. He paused. Then I heard my mother's voice. She called my name. And I was back. In the kennel. The pup was in front of me, gumming my finger. The room was still. The small man from the neck exchanged a glance with the woman beside him. The hawk on her arm gave a low, rasping cry. The silence in the study lingered for a moment longer. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and Padfoot let out a quiet huff, resting his chin on Arthur's boot. Then the woman with the hawk stepped forward, her voice calm and sure, with the cadence of someone used to speaking to both beasts and men. There's no doubt, she said, her eyes fixed on Arthur. The boy is a warg. The vision, the pull, the bond, it's all there. Strong, too. Stronger than most his age. Arthur kept his face still, though inside he felt a flicker of satisfaction. But he said nothing. Better to let them think he was hearing it for the first time. The woman turned to Ned. We'll need to test the others. If the bond runs in the blood, it may not have stopped with him. Ned nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to Arthur. His expression softened, the stern lines of his face easing into something gentler, something proud, and perhaps a little wary. Arthur, he said, stepping around the desk and kneeling beside his son. What you experienced, it wasn't a dream. It wasn't your imagination. It was something old. Something rare. He placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. You're a warg. That means you have the ability to enter the mind of an animal, to see through its eyes, feel what it feels. It's a gift, but it's also a responsibility. It can be dangerous, if not understood. Arthur nodded slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't need to pretend to be surprised, just thoughtful. Ned gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. You're not alone in this. We'll help you. And we've brought someone who knows more than I ever could. He stood and turned toward the woman. This is Mayra of the Cranoglins, he said. She's a skin changer, and a hawk warg. She's trained others like you. She's going to stay here at Winterfell for a time, to help you, and your brothers and sister, if they show the gift as well. Mayra inclined her head slightly, her hawk shifting on her arm and letting out a low, rasping cry. I'll teach you how to listen, she said. How to walk the line between your mind and the beasts. How to return when the pull is too strong. And how to protect yourself and your bond. Arthur looked up at her, then at his father. He gave a small nod. Over the next few hours, the study became a revolving door of small feet, curious eyes, and the occasional bark or yip. Ashura moved gracefully through it all, ushering each child in one by one, her expression composed but her eyes betraying a quiet tension. John came first, silent as always, dark-furred pup Bone padding beside him like a shadow. He answered Mayra's questions with short, precise nods and the occasional word. When asked how he felt around Bone, he simply said, like I'm not alone. That was enough. Mayra gave a knowing smile and nodded. Samwell followed, practically bouncing into the room with Mutton waddling behind him. His answers were more animated, descriptions of dreams where he ran on four legs, of knowing when Mutton was hungry before the pup even barked. Mayra's eyes gleamed with interest. Robb and Sansa took longer. At just over 1 year old, they didn't have the words to explain what they felt. Robb mostly babbled and pointed at his golden-furred pup, who barked excitedly at everything. Sansa clung to her white-furred companion, Snowdrop, and giggled when the pup licked her cheek. Mayra crouched beside them, watching closely, asking gentle questions, observing the way the pups responded to their moods, their movements, their touch. By the end of it, Mayra stood and turned to Ned and Ashura, her hawk shifting on her arm. All of them, she said simply. Every one of your children has the gift. Some stronger than others, but it's there. The bond is real. Ashura's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide. Ned exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable, though his jaw was tight with thought. You'll stay, he said to Mayra. Pick a room. Any you like. You'll have what you need. Mayra nodded. I'll begin training them slowly. One at a time, at first. The older ones will learn faster. The younger ones, we'll let the bond guide them. A guard stepped forward to escort her to the guest wing, and Mayra followed without another word, her hawk watching the children with sharp, golden eyes as she left. The door closed behind her. Ashura stood in the center of the room, her children gathered around her, Arthur with Padfoot at his feet, John with Bone at his side, Samwell tugging on her sleeve, Rob babbling to his pup, and Sansa cradling Snowdrop like a doll. She looked at them all, her expression softening with wonder and worry. Then her hand drifted to her belly, where the curve of new life had just begun to show beneath her gown. She looked up at Ned, her voice quiet. "Is it possible that the next one could be a walk too?" Ned met her gaze, his own eyes shadowed with thought. "If the blood runs this strong," he said, "then yes. It's more than possible." Ashura looked down at her children again, her hand still resting on her belly. The Godswood was quiet that afternoon, the red leaves of the heart tree rustling gently in the breeze. The air was cool and damp, the scent of moss and old bark thick beneath the canopy. It was here, beneath the watchful eyes of the weirwood, that Mayra had chosen to begin their lessons. Arthur sat cross-legged on the soft earth, Padfoot curled beside him, ears perked and alert. Samwell sat nearby, legs splayed out, Mutton sprawled across his lap like a warm, snoring pillow. The two boys were bundled in cloaks, their cheeks pink from the chill, their eyes wide with curiosity. John would begin his lessons tomorrow. Mayra stood before them, her hawk perched silently on her gloved arm, its golden eyes scanning the trees. Today she began, her voice low and even, "You begin learning what you are. Not just what you can do." Arthur leaned forward slightly, already focused. Samwell blinked up at her, his fingers absently stroking Mutton's ears. Mayra crouched down to their level, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "You are wargs. Skin changers. You have the blood of the old ones in you, the first men who walked with wolves and spoke to the trees. Before there were castles, before there were kings, there were people who could see through the eyes of beasts." Arthur nodded slowly. He'd read some of this in the interface, but hearing it aloud, hearing it spoken like truth, not myth, made it feel heavier. Realer. Samwell tilted his head. "So, we're like the old heroes." Mayra gave a faint smile. "Some of them, yes. But not all wargs were heroes. Some were feared. Hunted. Especially by those who came after." She stood again, her voice growing firmer. "You must understand something, both of you. What you are is rare. Powerful. And dangerous to the wrong ears." Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. "Dangerous to who?" Mayra's gaze drifted southward, as if she could see beyond the trees and hills. "To those who follow the faith of the Seven. The more devout among them believe your gift is unnatural, an abomination. They call it shadow binding, or worse. In the south, they burn witches for less." Samwell's face scrunched in confusion. "But, why? We're not bad." "No," Mayra said gently. "You're not. But fear doesn't care if something is good or bad. It only cares if it's different." Arthur's jaw tightened. He didn't like the idea of hiding. But he understood it. "So we keep it secret," he said. Mayra nodded. "Until you're strong enough to defend it. Until you know how to control it. You'll learn to walk in dreams, to feel your beast's thoughts, to guide without losing yourself. But until then, you tell no one outside this family. Not even your closest friends." Samwell looked down at Mutton, who snorted in his sleep. "But what if someone sees us?" "Then you lie," Mayra said simply. "Or you run. Or you fight. But you never give them the truth." Arthur looked up at her, his voice quiet but steady. "We understand." Mayra studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good," she said. "Then let's begin." Mayra moved to stand before Arthur and Samwell, her hawk now perched on a low branch above her, feathers ruffling in the breeze. The boys sat cross-legged on the mossy ground, their pups curled beside them, Padfoot alert and watchful, Mutton snoring softly with his legs twitching in a dream. "This," Mayra said, her voice low and steady, "is where it begins. Not with power. Not with control. But with stillness." Arthur straightened his back, his eyes sharp. Samwell blinked up at her, already fidgeting with a twig. Mayra knelt between them, drawing a simple circle in the dirt with her finger. "Warging isn't just about entering the mind of a beast. It's about listening. Feeling. You must learn to quiet your thoughts until you can hear theirs. She looked at Arthur. You've already brushed against it. That pull you felt when you first saw Padfoot, that was the bond forming. But now you must learn to reach for it without being pulled. Arthur nodded slowly. Mayra turned to Samwell. And you said you dreamed through Mutton's eyes. Samwell hesitated. I think so. I dreamed I was chasing something in the snow. I could smell it. I could feel the cold on my nose. But I was lower. Smaller. Mayra smiled faintly. Good. That's the first sign. Dreams are the doorway. Now we learn to open it while awake. She sat back on her heels and gestured for them to close their eyes. Breathe slowly. In through your nose. Out through your mouth. Feel the earth beneath you. The air around you. Let your thoughts drift, like leaves on a stream. Arthur obeyed, his breathing steady, his hands resting on his knees. He could feel Padfoot's warmth beside him, the soft rhythm of the pup's breath. He focused on that, on the quiet thrum of life just beyond his own skin. Samwell tried too, though his breathing was more uneven, his fingers twitching as he struggled to sit still. Mayra's voice was a whisper now. Reach for the bond. Not with your hands. With your mind. Imagine a thread between you and your pup. A silver thread, thin but strong. Follow it. Arthur's brow furrowed slightly. He could feel it, faint, like a heartbeat in the distance. A warmth that wasn't his. A presence just beyond the veil of thought. Then a flicker. A flash of scent, damp leaves, old bark, the musk of fur. A heartbeat that wasn't his own. He gasped softly, eyes snapping open. Padfoot was staring at him, ears perked, tail wagging slowly. Mayra's eyes gleamed. You felt it. Arthur nodded, breath shallow. Just for a second. That's all it takes, she said. The door is open now. With time, you'll learn to step through. She turned to Samwell, who was still squinting with one eye open. You too. Samwell shrugged. I think I felt something. Or maybe I just need to pee. Mayra chuckled. That's normal. The first time is always uncertain. But you'll get there. She stood, brushing moss from her knees. That's enough for today. Warging is like breathing underwater. You don't dive deep on your first breath. The fire in Ned's study crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the stone walls and the heavy oak desk cluttered with maps, letters, and a half-finished raven scroll. Outside, the wind whispered through the battlements of Winterfell, but within the chamber, the air was still. Ned sat in his high-backed chair, a tankard of dark ale in hand. Across from him, Howland leaned back slightly, his small frame wrapped in a thick green cloak, his eyes sharp beneath the shadow of his brow. The years had not dulled him. If anything, they'd made him quieter, more watchful. They drank in silence for a time, the kind of silence only old friends could share. Then Howland spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Will you tell him? Ned didn't need to ask who he meant. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. One day, he said. When he's older and he has a place of his own. A keep and lands. A name that's his. Howland nodded slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on Ned. And if that day never comes? Ned's jaw tightened. It will. There was steel in his voice. Howland took a sip of his ale, then set the tankard down gently. He's a good boy. Quiet. Thoughtful. But there's fire in him. You see it, don't you? I see it, Ned said. He's more like her than he knows. The fire popped, sending a small spray of sparks up the chimney. Does he suspect? Howland asked. No, Ned said. Not yet. He wonders, I think. But he's never asked. And I've never lied. I've just not told him everything. Howland gave a faint smile. A Stark's way of keeping secrets. Ned didn't smile back. Only 3 people know the truth. You. Me. And Ashura. And she's kept it. She's kept it, Ned said firmly. She loves him. As if he were her own. Howland nodded again, his fingers tracing the rim of his tankard. When the time comes, he'll need to know who he is. Not just for his sake. For the realms. Ned's eyes darkened. When the time comes, I'll tell him everything. Not before. The keep was quiet in the late afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun slanting through the high windows and casting long, warm shadows across the stone floors. In her and Ned's room Ashura sat on a cushioned bench near the hearth, her long hair braided loosely down her back, a soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The fire crackled gently, and the scent of lavender and old parchment lingered in the air. John was curled in her lap, his small body tucked against her like a kitten seeking warmth. His dark curls brushed her chin, and his thumb rested near his mouth, though he was too old to suck it now. His breathing was slow, steady, and then, barely audible, he murmured, "Mama." Ashura's heart clenched. She stroked his hair gently, her fingers trembling just slightly. "I'm here, sweeterling," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his temple. Across the room, Arthur and Samwell sat on the floor with their pups, Padfoot and Mutton, between them. They were deep in conversation, their voices hushed but animated. "She said I almost touched Mutton's thoughts," Samwell was saying, his eyes wide with excitement. "Like I could feel what he wanted before he even barked." Arthur nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's like a thread. You don't pull it, you follow it. Padfoot's thoughts are fuzzy, but they're there. I think I'll be able to see through his eyes soon." Samwell grinned. "Do you think we'll be able to talk to them? Like, really talk?" Arthur shrugged. "Maybe. Mayra said it's possible. But it takes time." Ashura listened with half an ear, her hand still resting on John's back. He had fallen asleep again, his breath warm against her neck. She looked down at him, at the peaceful expression on his face, and felt a pang deep in her chest. He was hers. In every way that mattered, he was her son. She had held him when he cried, sung him to sleep, kissed his scraped knees, and whispered stories into his dreams. He had never known another mother. And yet, one day, he would. One day, the truth would come because it had to. Because Ned had sworn it. And when that day came, when the truth was laid bare, it would break something in him. And in her. But that day was not today. Today, he was just a boy curled in her lap, whispering "Mama" in his sleep. Ashura closed her eyes and held him tighter, as if she could freeze this moment in time. Let tomorrow wait. 2 days after their first lesson, the Godswood was alive with birdsong and the rustle of wind through red leaves, the heart tree standing silent and ancient at its center. Beneath its boughs, Mayra knelt in the moss, her hawk perched on a nearby branch, watching with unblinking golden eyes. Arthur and Samwell sat across from her, their pups at their sides, Padfoot alert and poised, Mutton sprawled lazily on his back, tongue lolling out. "Today," Mayra said, her voice calm but firm, "you're going to call them. Not with your voice. With your bond." Arthur straightened, his eyes narrowing with focus. Samwell tilted his head, glancing at Mutton, who was currently more interested in a beetle crawling through the grass than any mystical connection. Mayra continued, "The bond between you and your beast is more than instinct. It's a thread of spirit. You've felt it already, now you must learn to tug it gently. Not command. Invite." She stood and stepped back, gesturing for the boys to remain seated. "I want you both to close your eyes. Breathe. Reach for that thread. Picture your pup. Picture them coming to you, not because you told them to, but because they want to." Arthur closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He could feel Padfoot's presence like a warm ember in the back of his mind, faint, but steady. He focused on that warmth, on the memory of Padfoot's joy when they played, his loyalty when they trained. He didn't speak. He simply opened the door in his mind and waited. A moment later, he felt it, a flicker of movement, a pulse of awareness. Padfoot stood, ears twitching, and padded over to Arthur, resting his head on the boy's knee with a soft huff. Arthur opened his eyes and smiled faintly. Mayra nodded in approval. "Good. That's the bond responding." Samwell, meanwhile, was squinting with one eye open, muttering under his breath. "Come on, Mutton. I'm picturing you. I'm picturing bacon. You love bacon." Mutton blinked, rolled over, and let out a snore. Arthur stifled a laugh. Mayra raised an eyebrow. Try again, Samwell. Less bacon. More heart. Samwell sighed, closed his eyes again, and this time, he focused, not on food, but on the way mutton always curled against him when he was sad. On the way the pup licked his face when he cried. On the warmth of that bond. Mutton stirred, then slowly waddled over and flopped into Samwell's lap. Samwell opened his eyes and grinned. I did it. Mayra smiled. You both did. That's the first step toward true communication. She crouched beside them, her tone turning thoughtful. When I'm satisfied with your progress, I'll have more animals brought in. Birds, foxes, maybe even a deer. Not all will bond. But some might. You'll know when it happens. Arthur's eyes lit up. More bonds. Mayra nodded. Eventually. But only when you're ready. The bond is sacred. It must be earned, not forced. Samwell looked down at Mutton, who was now chewing on his sleeve. What if I bond with a goose? Mayra chuckled. Then you'll be the first goose warg I've ever trained. Ashura sat at the head of the table beside Ned, her posture graceful but alert, her eyes flicking between her children with the practiced vigilance of a mother who knew mischief was always one breath away. And tonight, it was Samwell and John who were the culprits. Samwell Stark, Ashura said sharply, setting down her goblet. Stop trying to make Mutton eat your turnips. Samwell froze mid-glance, his eyes wide with exaggerated innocence. Mutton, seated beside him on a small cushion, was already chewing on a half-mashed turnip with a look of deep betrayal. I didn't say anything. Samwell protested. You didn't have to, Ashura replied, arching a brow. I can see it in your face. Across the table, John was doing his best to look invisible, but Bone was already gnawing on a piece of boiled carrot that had mysteriously appeared in front of him. John, Ashura said, her tone softening but still firm. You too. John looked up, cheeks pink. He likes them. He likes you, Ashura said, though her lips twitched with amusement. That doesn't mean you can feed him your vegetables. Arthur, seated beside Samwell, tried to stifle a laugh, but his attention was quickly drawn to the scene unfolding beneath the table. Padfoot had managed to drag an entire chicken leg off a platter and was now fiercely tugging it across the stone floor, growling softly as he went. The leg was nearly the size of his entire body, but that didn't stop him. His little legs scrambled for traction, his tail wagging like a banner of triumph. Behind him, the other pups had noticed. Bone crept forward with silent precision, eyes locked on the prize. Mutton, having abandoned his turnip, waddled after them with a determined grunt. Snowdrop padded daintily behind, ears perked and nose twitching. Padfoot let out a warning growl, his tiny body hunched protectively over the chicken leg. He bared his teeth, adorably, and gave a bark that was more squeak than threat. Arthur leaned down, watching with a mix of pride and exasperation. You're going to choke on that, you know. Padfoot ignored him, dragging the leg beneath the table like a victorious wolf returning to his den. Ashura sighed, rubbing her temples. I should have known dinner would turn into a pack hunt. Ned chuckled beside her, lifting his goblet. At least they're learning to share. Ashura gave him a look. They're learning to steal. Arthur grinned, watching as Padfoot finally settled with his prize, the other pups circling like wolves around a carcass. The clamor beneath the table reached a fever pitch within seconds. Padfoot stood over the chicken leg like a tiny warlord, his scruffy fur bristling, lips curled in a growl that was more squeak than snarl. Bone had one paw planted on the other end, tugging silently, his pale eyes locked in a quiet challenge. Mutton had flopped bodily onto the leg, chewing with lazy determination, while Snowdrop darted in and out like a ghost, trying to snatch a bite without getting caught in the fray. Arthur watched the chaos unfold with a sigh, then glanced up at the table. A platter of roasted pork sat nearby, still steaming. He reached for it, careful and quick, and plucked off a few small chunks. With a glance to his left, his mother was mid-conversation with Ned. He leaned down and flicked the pork under the table. Here, he whispered. Fair trade. The effect was immediate. Mutton's nose twitched. He paused mid-chew, then abandoned the chicken leg entirely, waddling toward the pork with a delighted grunt. Snowdrop followed, nimble and quick, snatching a piece and retreating to a quiet corner. Even Bone hesitated, ears flicking toward the scent, before releasing the leg and slinking after the meat. Padfoot, triumphant, let out a muffled growl and resumed gnawing on his oversized prize, tail wagging like a banner of victory. Arthur sat back up, brushing his hands on his tunic with a satisfied nod. Then he felt it. He looked up slowly. Ashura was watching him from across the table, her violet eyes narrowed, one brow arched in that way that made Arthur's stomach twist. She hadn't missed a thing. "Arthur," she said, her voice calm but edged with warning, "did you just bribe your siblings' pups with pork?" Arthur blinked. "I redistributed the meat to avoid conflict." Samwell snorted into his cup. John tried to hide a grin behind his hand. Even Ned looked vaguely amused, though he wisely kept his eyes on his plate. Ashura exhaled slowly, setting down her goblet. "You're not supposed to feed them from the table." Arthur straightened. "Technically, I fed them under the table." Her brow arched higher. He wilted slightly. "Sorry, Mother." "Don't do it again," she said. "No more feeding them from the table, above or below. If they are going to be part of this household, they'll learn discipline. And so will you." Arthur nodded, chastened. "Yes, Mother." He glanced down beneath the table, where Padfoot was locked in a fierce battle with the chicken leg, growling softly as he wrestled it across the stone floor. The leg was nearly as long as he was, but that didn't stop him. He had one paw braced against it, his teeth sunk into the meat, tail wagging in fierce determination. Every few seconds, he'd let out a low, rumbling growl, as if daring anyone to challenge his claim. The other pups had forgotten the leg entirely. Bone was crouched over a chunk of pork, tearing into it with silent precision. Mutton had flattened his face against a slab of meat, chewing noisily with his eyes half closed in bliss. Snowdrop, ever dainty, had taken her piece to a quiet corner and was nibbling it with delicate bites, ears twitching at every sound. Arthur couldn't help but smile. It was chaos, but it was their chaos. Ashura followed his gaze, then sighed and shook her head. "They are going to be wild," she murmured. "Just like the children." Arthur turned back to his own plate, the scent of roasted boar and warm bread rising to meet him. The pups beneath the table were still occupied, Padfoot gnawing with single-minded fury, the others tearing into their pork with gleeful abandon. With the chaos momentarily contained, Arthur finally focused on his own meal. As he picked up a rib, a soft shimmer passed over his vision. Boar ribs effect, +10 strength, temporary 1 hour. Crusty bread, barley and rye, effect, +5 stamina, temporary 30 minutes. Frost grapes effect, +5 focus, temporary 20 minutes. Salted almonds effect, +2 bond XP, Padfoot, first consumption bonus shared food, shared spirit. Spiced sausage, boar and herb, effect, +5 vitality, temporary 45 minutes. He popped an almond into his mouth, and took a bite of the ribs next, savoring the smoky flavor, feeling the subtle surge of strength settle into his limbs like a second heartbeat. The buffs stacked neatly in the corner of his vision, their timers ticking down with quiet precision. Active effects. Strength +10, 59 hours 42 minutes. Stamina +5, 28 hours 17 minutes. Focus +5, 1903. Vitality +5, 44 hours 12 minutes. Bond XP +2, applied. Arthur wiped his hands on a cloth and glanced down at Padfoot, who was still gnawing on the chicken leg like it was a dragon's bone. The other pups were sprawled in various states of meat-induced bliss, tails thumping lazily. He reached for the last item on his plate, a small, wrinkled red pod nestled beside the grapes. The dragon pepper. Its skin was glossy and taut, its scent sharp and fiery even from a distance. Samwell, seated beside him and still nursing a piece of bread, wrinkled his nose the moment he saw it. "You're not actually going to eat that, are you?" he asked, eyes wide. "Those things are evil." Arthur didn't answer right away. He simply picked up the pepper between two fingers, holding it up to the light. The interface shimmered softly. Dragon pepper effect, +10 fire resistance, temporary 1 hour, effect, +2 willpower, temporary 30 minutes, pain is a teacher. Fire is a forge. He turned to Samwell, met his eyes, and, without breaking eye contact, bit into the pepper. The heat hit instantly. It was like swallowing a spark. His eyes watered, his throat burned, and his ears rang faintly. But he didn't flinch. He chewed slowly, deliberately, and swallowed. Samuel stared at him like he'd just grown a second head. "You're mad," he muttered. "Completely mad." Arthur exhaled through his nose, the fire still dancing across his tongue. "It's not that bad." Samuel blinked. "You're sweating." Arthur wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. "I'm not." Padfoot looked up from his chicken leg, sniffed the air, and sneezed violently. Arthur grinned through the burn, the interface quietly updating in the corner of his vision. Sparkle's active effects. Strength plus 10, boar ribs 52 hours 31 minutes. Stamina plus 5, bread 2106. Focus plus 5, grapes 1152. Vitality plus 5, sausage 37 hours 1 minutes. Fire resistance plus 10, dragon pepper 59 hours 48 minutes. Willpower plus 2, dragon pepper 29 hours 59 minutes. He leaned back in his chair, eyes still watering slightly, and took a long sip of water. "See," he said hoarsely. "Perfectly fine." Samuel shook his head, muttering, "You're going to breathe fire in your sleep." Arthur wiped the last of the sweat from his brow, the fire of the dragon pepper still simmering on his tongue like a forge left banked. He leaned toward Samuel with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Watch this," he said under his breath. Before Samuel could protest, Arthur plucked another dragon pepper from the small bowl near the bread and, with a flick of his fingers, sent it tumbling off the edge of the table. It landed with a soft thud on the stone floor beneath them. Ashura's voice rang out immediately. "Arthur Stark, do not feed the pups dragon peppers." But it was too late. The pepper rolled to a stop in the middle of the floor, and the pups, who had been lounging in a meat-induced stupor, perked up at once. Bone was the first to approach, nose twitching. He gave the pepper a cautious sniff, then recoiled with a startled yelp. Mutton waddled over next, sniffed once, and let out a dramatic sneeze before turning tail and bolting under the nearest bench. Snowdrop crept forward delicately, gave the pepper a single disdainful glance, and trotted away with her nose in the air. Padfoot, however, was the last to investigate. He padded up to the pepper, sniffed it, sneezed once, then let out a low, offended growl. But instead of fleeing, he turned sharply, darted over to where Snowdrop had left her pork unattended, snatched it in his jaws, and bolted from the hole with triumphant yipping. The other pups followed, whining and yipping as they scattered in all directions, one diving under a table, another slipping through a crack in the wall, tails tucked and paws scrambling. The whole erupted in laughter. Even Ned couldn't hide a smirk as he reached for his goblet. Ashura, however, was not amused. She fixed Arthur with a look that could have frozen a river. "Arthur," she said slowly, "if I see one more pepper leave that table, I will have Maester Lewin mix your next meal with milk and porridge for a week." Arthur raised his hands in surrender, trying not to laugh. "Understood." Samuel, still watching the last pup vanish through a doorway, shook his head. "The pups have more sense than you." The boys' room was quiet now, the chaos of dinner long behind them. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting a soft amber glow across the stone walls and the thick woolen blankets tucked around each bed. Outside, the wind whispered through the towers of Winterfell, but within the room, all was warm and still. Ashura moved gently between the beds, her long gown brushing the floor, her hair unbound and trailing like shadowed silk down her back. She carried a single candle, its flame flickering softly as she leaned over Arthur's bed first. He was already half asleep, Padfoot curled at his feet like a warm, breathing stone. Arthur blinked up at her, his eyes heavy but still glinting with mischief. "I don't know where you got your taste for dragon peppers," Ashura murmured, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "But it certainly wasn't from me." Arthur gave a sleepy grin. "Maybe from father." Ashura chuckled under her breath. "If that's true, I'll be having words with him." She leaned down and kissed his brow, her lips soft and cool. "Sleep well, my little wildfire." Next, she moved to Samuel's bed. He was already snoring softly, mutton sprawled across his chest like a furry blanket. Ashura smiled and gently adjusted the covers, tucking them around his shoulders. "You, at least, have the sense to fear your food," she whispered, kissing his cheek. Even if you follow your brother into madness. Finally, she came to John. He was curled on his side, Bone nestled behind his knees, both of them breathing in quiet rhythm. John stirred slightly as she sat beside him, his eyes fluttering open. "Mama," he murmured. "I'm here," she said softly, smoothing his hair. "Go back to sleep." He closed his eyes again, and she kissed his temple, lingering just a moment longer. Ashura stood, the candle casting her shadow tall against the wall. She looked at her sons as she blew out the candle. Darkness settled gently over the room. "Good night, my loves," she whispered. The fire in Ned's study crackled softly, casting long shadows across the stone walls and the shelves lined with old tomes and raven scrolls. The hour was late, and the keep had quieted, but the Stark brothers were still awake, seated across from one another with tankards of dark ale in hand. Benjen leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his expression wary. "You didn't bring me up here just to drink, did you?" Ned gave a faint smile, though his eyes were serious. "No, I didn't." Benjen sighed. "I thought so." Ned set his tankard down and folded his hands on the desk. "You're nearing 20, Benjen. It's time." Benjen groaned. "You sound like Maester Lewin." "I sound like a brother who wants to see you settled," Ned said evenly. "You've served the North well. You've kept Winterfell safe when I've been away. You've helped raise my children. You deserve a home of your own. A family." Benjen looked away, jaw tight. "And you've already picked out a few candidates, haven't you?" Ned didn't deny it. "I have." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small stack of parchment, notes, letters, and family trees. He slid them across the desk. "I've spoken with a few houses." Quietly. "Nothing formal. But there are options." Benjen glanced at the papers, then back at Ned. "And who's your favorite?" Ned didn't hesitate. "Daisy Mormont." Benjen blinked. "Daisy? She's, what, 2 years younger than me?" "3," Ned corrected. "And she's strong. Fierce. Loyal. She's already leading Mormont warriors into battle. She wouldn't flinch at life in Winterfell, or at your duties. She'd match you stride for stride." Benjen leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "She's also got a temper like a bear." Ned chuckled. "So do you." Benjen was quiet for a moment, then said, "You really think she'd have me?" "I think she respects you," Ned said. "And I think she'd be good for you. You don't need someone to flatter you, Benjen. You need someone who'll challenge you. Someone who'll stand beside you when the snows come." Benjen looked down at the parchment, then back at his brother. "I'll think on it." Ned nodded. "That's all I ask." The firelight danced across the stone walls of Ned's study, casting flickering shadows that seemed to echo the weight of the conversation. Benjen was still thumbing through the parchment when Ned leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting, more thoughtful now, more measured. "There's something else," Ned said, his voice low and steady. "Something I've been considering for some time." Benjen looked up, sensing the change in tone. "Go on." Ned reached for a map rolled up beside the hearth. He unfurled it across the desk, smoothing it with practiced hands. His finger traced north of Winterfell, past the last river, to the long, narrow strip of land nestled between the wall and the gift. "The new gift," Ned said. "The land south of the wall, granted to the Night's Watch by the Starks of old. It's been abandoned for generations, fields gone fallow, villages empty. But it's still ours, in truth. And I'm thinking of asking Robert to return it to us. Formally." Benjen raised an eyebrow. "You want the gift back?" Ned nodded. "Not to take from the Watch. To help them. The Watch is dwindling, Benjen. They need allies, not just oaths. If we settle the gift again, if we build keeps, restore villages, we can create a buffer. A line of defense. And a line of support." Benjen leaned forward, intrigued now. "And you want me to lead it?" "I do," Ned said. "I want you to take the first keep. Set down roots. Begin a cadet branch of House Stark. You've earned it. And the North needs it." Benjen was silent for a long moment, eyes scanning the map. Where? Ned tapped a spot just east of the King's Road, near the ruins of an old village. Queenscrown. It's defensible, close to the road, and near the lake. The land's good. The village can be rebuilt. You'd have the support of the mountain clans and the Watch. And with the right investment, it could thrive again. Benjen exhaled slowly. That's a bold move. Ned gave a faint smile. The North was built by bold moves. He leaned back, folding his arms. I've already begun quiet talks with Gia Mormont. He's not opposed. And I'll speak to Robert soon. He owes me more than a few favors. Rob will have a keep as well one day. Further west, near the Bay of Seals. I'm considering building a port there, something small at first, but enough to trade with Bravos and the Free Cities. The North needs more than grain and timber. We need silver. Ships. Influence. Benjen gave a low whistle. You're not just thinking of defense. You're thinking of expansion. I'm thinking of the future, Ned said. Of what we'll leave behind. The North is waking, Benjen. The old blood is stirring. We need to be ready, for what's coming, and for what we can build. Benjen looked down at the map again, his eyes lingering on Queenscrown. A Stark of Queenscrown, he murmured. That has a ring to it. Benjen traced the edge of the map with a calloused finger, his eyes lingering on the coastlines and ruined strongholds. After a long pause, he glanced up at his brother, a knowing look in his eye. You're planning to give Arthur Moat Cailin, he said quietly. And John C. Dragon Point. Ned didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his expression was thoughtful. Moat Cailin is the gate to the north. It's too important to leave abandoned. Arthur's already showing the discipline and clarity to hold it. Benjen nodded. And John? Ned's eyes softened. See, Dragon Point is wild, but it has promise. The cliffs are high, the forests thick, and the sea is rich. It was once a place of strength before the fleets were burned. Bran the Burner, Benjen muttered. He destroyed the Northern Fleet after his father disappeared out at sea. And we've been landlocked ever since. Ned's gaze drifted to the fire. Ashura's the one who pushed me to change that. She said the North has been too quiet for too long. Too isolated. She wants our children to look outward, not just inward. Benjen studied his brother for a moment, then said, so you're going to ask Robert to fund the rebuilding of the fleet? Ned's jaw tightened slightly. Yes. But you hate doing it, Benjen said, not unkindly. Ned didn't deny it. Robert's my oldest friend. He'd give me anything I asked for. But I don't like asking. Not for favors. Not for gold. Not for ships. Benjen leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. You're not asking for yourself. You're asking for the North. For your children. Ned gave a slow nod. I know. But it still feels like taking advantage. Benjen smirked. Robert's a king. He can afford to be generous. And if he's smart, he'll see that a northern fleet helps the realm, not just us. Ned looked up, his eyes steady. That's what I'll tell him. Benjen sat back, folding his arms. So? Arthur at Moat Cailin. John at Sea Dragon Point. Rob with a port on the Bay of Seals. Me at Queenscrown. You've been thinking a lot about the future, keeps, ports, fleets. Ned gave a quiet nod. And marriages. Benjen raised an eyebrow. They're still babes, Ned. I know, Ned said, not defensively, but with the calm certainty of a man who had weighed the matter long before speaking it aloud. Nothing is set in stone. But the world doesn't wait for children to grow before it starts shaping their paths. Ashura and I, we've begun the conversations. Benjen gave a low whistle. Old gods help them. Ned allowed himself a faint smile. We're not forcing anything. But we're laying the groundwork. Samwell, for instance, we've spoken with Lord Wyman. Winifred is a few years older, but she's bright, kind, and already learning the ways of court. The Mandaelis are loyal, and their ties to White Harbor would give Samwell a strong foothold in the east. Benjen nodded slowly. That's not a bad match. And John? Alis Karstark, Ned said. She's only a year younger. The Karstarks are kin, and Alis has the makings of a strong lady. Quiet, but sharp. She and John would understand each other. Benjen tilted his head. And Arthur? Ned's expression shifted slightly, just enough for Benjen to notice. We considered Arianne Martell, Ned admitted. Ashura wrote to Doran herself. But the Martells declined. Politely. Benjen snorted. Not surprising. Doran's always been cautious. And considering what happened at the end of the rebellion. Ned gave him a look. So what now? Benjen changed the subject. I'm considering the Vale, Ned said. Yohn Royce has a daughter, Ysilla. She's a little younger than Arthur, but not by much. The Royces are old blood, proud and honorable. Ysilla's been raised with steel in her spine and sense in her head. I'll speak with Yohn when next we meet. Hopefully around the time of your marriage. Chapter 6, War and Birth. Chapter text. 288.c. The air in the neck was thick with mist and the scent of damp earth, the marshes stretching out in every direction like a living maze of reeds, water, and shadow. The sun hung low behind a veil of clouds, casting a pale, silvery light over the bogs. Dragonflies buzzed lazily through the air, and the occasional croak of a frog echoed across the still water. Arthur stood on a patch of dry ground, his boots caked in mud, his cloak damp from the morning fog. At 6, he was taller now, leaner, his face sharper with the beginnings of manhood, but his eyes still held that quiet, calculating gleam. Padfoot stood at his side, larger than ever, his mottled grey-black coat slick with dew, his pale eyes scanning the marsh with the same alertness as his master. Behind them, a small escort of Stark guards waited patiently, their armor dulled to avoid drawing attention in the swamp. And beside Arthur stood two figures, his uncle Benjen, clad in dark leathers, his expression unreadable as always, and Mayra of the Cranoglans, her hawk perched on her shoulder, feathers ruffled against the damp. It's hard to believe it's been 3 years, Benjen said, glancing at Arthur. You were barely up to my chest when we started this. Arthur smirked. And you still thought I'd get eaten by a frog? Still might, Benjen muttered, though there was a flicker of pride in his voice. Mayra stepped forward, her boots making no sound on the wet ground. You've come far. Arthur nodded, though a flicker of frustration crossed his face. It took 3 years to get here. From level 1 to 5. I don't even want to think about how long it'll take to reach 10. Mayra gave a knowing smile. The bond deepens slower the further you go. Arthur opened his interface with a blink, the familiar shimmer of the Warg skill tree unfolding before him. Warg skill tree bond level, 5/10 XP, 10,040/12,000 bonded beast, Padfoot, Northern Wolfhound, bond slots, 1/2 new bond slot unlocked. He closed it with a thought, his heart beating faster. A second bond. Finally. Mayra gestured toward the marsh ahead. The Crannog men have gathered a few animals. Some wild, some raised. You'll know when the bond stirs. Don't force it. Let it find you. Arthur nodded and stepped forward, Padfoot padding beside him. They crossed a narrow causeway of woven reeds and stone, the mist parting to reveal a small clearing surrounded by water. Within it were several animals, each tethered loosely or watched by handlers. A sleek marsh cat with golden eyes. A great heron with a long, curved beak. A swamp fox with russet fur. A massive turtle half submerged in a pool. And perched on a branch, a black feathered raven, its eyes gleaming with uncanny intelligence. Arthur's breath caught. He could feel it already. A faint tug. Not as strong as the one he'd felt with Padfoot, but there. A thread, waiting to be drawn. Mayra watched him closely. Take your time. Choose wisely. But Arthur's eyes were drawn elsewhere. Curled around a half-submerged log at the far end of the clearing was a massive water snake. Its scales shimmered with hues of green and black, blending perfectly with the moss and algae. Its head rested atop the log, eyes half-lidded, tongue flicking lazily in and out. It was easily the length of a longboat, thick as a man's thigh, and utterly still, yet Arthur felt it before he truly saw it. A pool. Not like the bond he had with Padfoot, which had been immediate and warm. This was colder, deeper. A slow, coiling awareness that brushed the edge of his mind like a ripple across still water. That one, Arthur said quietly. Mayra followed his gaze, her brow lifting slightly. The water serpent. Arthur nodded. I can feel it. It's waiting. Benjen stepped forward, eyeing the creature warily. Are you sure? That thing could crush a man in its coils. Arthur didn't look away. It won't. Mayra studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Then go to it. But carefully. The second bond is not like the first. It will test you. Arthur stepped forward, Padfoot staying behind with a low whine. The air grew cooler as he approached the water's edge, the mist thickening around his boots. The snake's eyes opened fully now, slitted, ancient, and unblinking. Arthur knelt slowly, not speaking, not reaching. He simply opened his mind. And the serpent stirred. A slow, deliberate awareness that slid into his thoughts like water through cracks in stone. It did not speak, but it knew him. It tasted his fear, his strength, his memories. It coiled around his mind, not to crush, but to measure. Arthur didn't flinch. He let it in. And the bond took root. The serpent's tongue flicked once more, then it uncoiled from the log and slid into the water, circling the island in a slow, sinuous arc before returning to rest near Arthur's feet. Mayra exhaled softly. It's done. Benjen shook his head in disbelief. You've bonded with a bloody marsh WYRM. Arthur exhaled slowly, his breath curling in the damp air. A snake. Of course it was a snake. He crouched beside the creature, watching the way it moved, fluid, deliberate, without fear. There was no affection in the bond, not like with Padfoot. But there was understanding. Recognition. A shared silence that spoke louder than words. In another life, he thought, I spoke to creatures like this. The memory wasn't sharp, not anymore. It came in fragments. Parcel tongue. That was what it had been called. He had spoken it like a birthright, once. He didn't remember the words now. But the feeling remained. The snake shifted slightly, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. Arthur felt the echo of it in his mind, like a ripple across still water. Not speech, but something close. A communion of instinct and thought. He reached out, not with his hand, but with his mind, and the serpent responded, brushing against his consciousness with a slow, deliberate pulse. Behind him, Mayra and Benjen watched in silence. Padfoot stood at a distance, tail low, wary but not hostile. The snake moved with a slow, ancient grace, its body sliding through the marsh water like a living river. Arthur stood motionless as it approached, his boots sunken into the muddy bank, arms at his sides, eyes calm and unblinking. Then, without hesitation, the creature began to coil around him, once, twice, 3 times, its thick, gleaming body encircling the 6-year-old with quiet authority. It was easily twice his length, thicker than his chest, yet its grip was gentle, protective rather than threatening. The snake's head came to rest near Arthur's cheek, tongue flicking in and out as if tasting his thoughts. From the shore, Benjen took a sharp step forward, his breath catching in his throat. Gods, he murmured, eyes wide. He's going to be crushed. But Mayra held out a hand to stop him, her voice steady. No. It's not hurting him. Arthur didn't look at them. He barely noticed their presence. The world had narrowed to the cool, steady presence of the snake and the quiet tide of his own thoughts of the last 3 years. He thought of the day Arya was born, his little sister, fierce from the very start, kicking and howling in their mother's arms. Ashura had smiled in that weary, glowing way only mothers could. He thought of the wedding feast, loud and wild, tables overflowing, songs roaring through the hall like thunder. Daisy Mormont had been a storm herself, laughing as she pulled Benjen away from the crowd after the last toast, boots echoing down stone corridors. Samwell had snickered into his goblet, and Padfoot had let out a soft, amused growl. He'd watched it all, small and sharp-eyed, taking in the smiles and the secrets beneath them. Even now, as the serpent's coils wrapped him in silent communion, he didn't feel afraid. Not even a little. Benjen's voice came again, barely above a whisper. Ashura will kill me if. She won't, Mayra said, almost fond. She'll see the bond. Arthur closed his eyes, leaning just slightly into the snake's touch. The snake remained coiled around him, a cool, steady weight against the damp air. Arthur, small but resolute, rested his cheek against the scaled body and stared across the misty bog in quiet thought. His fingers trailed absently along the smooth surface of the serpent's hide as a name whispered through him, not in English, not in the common tongue, but in something older. Kalia. It came with images half remembered, a great serpent from another life, worshipped by Muggles as a god, feared and revered in equal measure. The stories had twisted with time, villagers building shrines, offering milk and flowers along the riverbank, mistaking power for divinity. Kalia, Arthur said aloud, almost shyly. That's your name. The snake lifted its head slightly, tongue flicking once. A silent acceptance. Benjen, still watching from the shore, frowned. What does it mean? Arthur didn't answer right away. He reached up and gently touched the serpent's head, eyes thoughtful and calm, as if cradling the memory of something sacred. It means power, he said finally. But quiet. And deep. Like the river you don't hear until it floods. The snake's coils loosened slightly, but Kalia stayed wrapped around Arthur's small frame as if the creature had declared itself his living cloak, and the boy wore it proudly. Mayra, arms folded, studied the strange tableau a moment longer before letting out a quiet sigh. Come, she said, nodding toward the hill above the marsh. It's time the little lord saw his future keep. Benjen blinked, hesitated, then scoffed under his breath as they began to walk. Ashura and Ned are going to have heart attacks, he muttered. 6 years old, wrapped in a bloody snake the size of a ship's mast. Arthur didn't respond. He moved with quiet purpose, boots squelching in the soft ground, Kalia winding like a sash around his body. Padfoot padded beside them, tail low and ears alert, giving the snake just enough space to avoid offense. The climb up the hill was steady, the landscape unfolding with each step. Morning mist clung to the marshes below, but ahead, the horizon lifted to reveal jagged stone towers rising from the swamp like ancient teeth. Moat Cailin. Benjen pointed with a gloved hand. 7 new towers, strong as Winterfell's wall. And we're restoring the 3 that still stood, though the old ones moan with every gust of wind. Might be haunted, if you ask me. Arthur squinted. The towers looked oddly regal despite the mire, rough, thickly built, practical in their defenses. A place not made to charm, but to endure. Looks like it belongs to the land, Arthur said softly. Benjen nodded, a rare hint of pride slipping past his usual caution. Aye. And so do we, now more than ever. He turned, gesturing toward the northern stretch of land beyond the keep. See there? That marshland, used to be useless. Just muck and biting flies. But trading with Bravos opened a few doors. The Mandaealis discovered a new type of food over there from Yeti called rice. Ned hired a handful of folk from there, farmers, clever ones. Said the rice paddies are easy to make in the swamp. With our fishing expanding in the deeper channels, we're nearly self-sufficient. We won't need grain from the south soon. Arthur looked out across the wet fields, imagining them filled with tall green stalks and northern hands plucking life from the soil. Rice from Yeti wasn't all, Benjen continued. We've got swamp cabbage popping up all along the edges, Mayra swears it tastes better pickled. Taro roots thriving too, with its broad leaves and starchy hearts. Duck potatoes, arrowheads, water chestnuts, sinks if you drop 'em, but they cook up sweet. He paused, rubbing his chin with a satisfied grunt. Then there are cranberries, he said, pointing toward a darker patch beside one of the wider bogs. They're temperamental, but they like the peat. Found a few hardy pear trees too, small fruits, but good for drying. Bit tart. Arthur blinked, taking it all in. He hadn't known the marsh could do all that. And more, Benjen added, voice warming. Marsh marigold for greens. Pickerel weed's edible, shockingly. Cattails, you can eat the roots, and the pollen makes flour. Sacred lotus, that one came from Yeti as well. They say it grows best when it's sung to. My keep will feed the north, he said quietly. Benjen raised a brow. That's the plan, little man. The doors to the council chamber slammed open with an echo that sent ravens scattering from the windowsills. Robert Baratheon stumbled through, boots muddied, doublet half-laced, and a flagon of wine still clutched in one meaty fist. His crown was absent, as usual, and the flush in his cheeks made it clear this wasn't his first drink of the morning. "What in the seven bloody hells is so important that you drag me away from my fun?" he growled, voice rough as gravel on stone. The council exchanged glances. Varys gave a flutter of his fingers. Stannis looked annoyed at his older brother. Pycelle coughed softly, his beard twitching. "Your Grace, there are ladies." "I know why you're all staring," Robert snapped. "I left two perfectly lovely women waiting in my chambers and not one of you better say a word about it." Silence followed, strained and thick. Jon Arryn cleared his throat and rose, the only one who could speak to Robert without risking a punch. A letter came from Ned. Robert's scowl faded slightly, attention sharpening as he handed his half-empty flagon to a nearby steward. "From Ned, you say? Well, go on then." "He's been in quiet talks with Lord Commander Jeor Mormont," Jon said, unfolding the parchment carefully. "It seems they've been planning for some time. Ned proposes that the Crown formally take back the gift, restore the abandoned keeps and resettle the villages to support the Watch." Robert blinked. Jon continued, "With more farmers and hunters settled close to Castle Black and the other outposts, the Watch would have stable food stores, trade routes, and better recruitment. Ned believes it could turn the tide of their decline." Before Jon could finish, Robert slammed a hand against the oak table with a grin. "Done. Yes. Gods, give that man the lands already." Pycelle shifted, his voice dripping caution. "Your Grace, might I remind you, the gift was granted centuries ago, in the time of the Targaryens. Reclaiming lands, even in support of the Watch, may stir tension. There are lords who still whisper about the old dragon treaties." Robert rounded on him, eyes wild. "I don't give a fuck what those dragon cunts did." Pycelle shrank back slightly, clearing his throat. Robert glared around the room, then smirked. "Tell Ned he has my blessing. Let him build his towers. And if anyone complains, they can come complain to my hammer." He turned, already stalking toward the door, tossing back one final comment over his shoulder. "Now, unless someone else wants to ruin my day, I'm going back to my fun." "If I may, Your Grace," Varys began, hands steepled delicately. "While Lord Stark's proposal for the gift is indeed commendable, there are whispers." Robert arched an eyebrow, clearly enjoying himself now. "Whispers, is it? Gods, I miss when trouble came with banners and swords." "These don't need banners," Varys said smoothly. "Only quiet footsteps and well-placed stone shipments. It seems Lord Stark's ambitions stretch beyond the gift." Jon Arryn frowned. "Go on." "There is talk, unconfirmed, of course," Varys continued, voice like silk over steel, "that Lord Stark has resumed the reconstruction of Moat Cailin. Not merely minor repairs. Full fortification. And there are curious movements at Sea Dragon Point. New docks. Foreign farmers. Yetish traders. Some say a small fleet of fishing vessels is being outfitted there with northern gold." Robert's brow furrowed deeper. "Sea Dragon Point. I thought that place was nothing but trees and rock and a few half-sunk longships." "Exactly, Your Grace," Varys said with a whisper of a smile. "Which makes its sudden rebirth noteworthy." Renly glanced at Jon, then leaned forward with a playful smirk. "So, Stark is quietly rebuilding the north, Moat Cailin, Sea Dragon Point, the gift. Sounds like he's preparing for something more than bandits and blizzards." Robert grunted. "Preparing for what? A dance party with wildlings?" Pycelle coughed. "There may be implications, Your Grace. The keeps at Moat Cailin were once key to defending the neck. If made strong again, they could effectively isolate the north from the south. Some might find that unsettling." Robert slammed his cup down with a low growl. "Some might be fools. It's Ned. If he's building, it's for the realm. You want men who see trouble coming, not wait until it's kicking down your gates." Varys tilted his head. "Of course, Your Grace. Lord Stark's loyalty is well known." Robert waved him off with a snort. "Let the man build. Gods know someone should be doing something worth remembering. If he's fortifying the wild edges of the realm, good. If he's planning for some threat we don't see, better." Jonarin gave a subtle nod. Then we'll send word to support the gift resettlement. And, keep a closer eye on the neck. Robert stood, stretching with a groan. Fine. But next time you haul me into this room, it better not be to read tea leaves and worry over some swamp. Arthur rode ahead atop a shaggy northern pony, Padfoot loping faithfully at his side. His tunic was loose and layered, shifting in curious ways as something slithered beneath its folds. The guards barely noticed. But his family was already rushing forward. Ashura stood near the steps, flanked by the children who had gathered in anticipation. Arya clung to Ned's leg, her tiny hands sticky with a half-eaten apple. Sansa held on to Rob's wrist, both of them peeking out with shy curiosity. Jon stood proudly just behind Samwell, who bounced on the balls of his feet the moment he spotted Arthur. "Arthur!" Samwell called, waving both arms. "You're back." Arthur grinned and slid off his pony, dust flying up around his boots. Samwell was on him in seconds, pulling him into a hug, but froze when he felt something strange beneath the fabric. "Your tunic's alive," he whispered. Sansa, clinging to Rob's hand, took a cautious step back. "Is something under there?" she asked, half horrified, half fascinated. Ashura narrowed her eyes. "What did you bring back, Arthur?" Without flinching, Arthur reached into his tunic and gently lifted the thick, gleaming coils of Kalia into view. The snake was massive compared to Arthur's small frame, its body easily thicker than his arm and its golden eyes blinking calmly at the gathering. Sansa squealed and darted behind a guard. Arya giggled and pointed. "SSS." Rob's eyes went wide. "It's huge." Jon stepped forward. "Is it safe?" Padfoot snorted nearby, unimpressed. Arthur beamed. "His name's Kalia. He's my friend." Samwell blinked. "Your friend's a snake." Ashura took slow steps forward, her gaze scanning the serpent that was curled around her second son's body. "I bonded with him in the swamp." Arthur stroked the serpent's head with practiced ease. Kalia blinked once and curled slightly tighter around his shoulders, tongue flicking toward Sansa, who let out another startled yelp. Arya tried climbing onto Ned's arm to get a better look. "Snake. Snake." She spoke calmly, but her eyes held concern. "We'll talk later," she said. "After you've let your brothers breathe and your sister uneyed." Arthur padded through the long stone corridors of Winterfell, soft torchlight flickering against the damp walls as Padfoot kept pace beside him with a casual lope. The halls were quieter now, full of the hush that only returned after a flurry of greetings and a storm of questions. Jon, Robb, and Samwell trailed behind, a mix of excitement and nervous curiosity burning in their wide eyes. Arthur opened the heavy wooden door to his room and stepped inside, the scent of wolf fur and cold stone familiar after weeks away. The boys crowded just behind the doorway, peering in with anticipation. With a small smile, Arthur tugged at the bottom of his tunic. Kalia moved. Slowly, like unraveling fate, the serpent began to slither free. His sleek coils spilled out across the floor, smooth as river glass, revealing his full size. 13 feet of muscle and glossy scales rippled across the stone, curling near Arthur's feet before lifting his head to blink at the boys. Jon's mouth dropped at the sight. Robb took a cautious step forward, eyes gleaming. "He's huge. He could wrap around all of us at once," Samwell whispered, half in awe, half in terror. Kalia slithered forward calmly, head low, tongue flicking gently at each boy in turn. "He doesn't bite unless you lie," Arthur said seriously. Robb blinked. "Lie about what?" "About anything," Arthur replied with a shrug. "He doesn't like liars." Samwell instantly clamped his mouth shut. Jon crouched beside Padfoot, watching as the wolfhound sniffed at the serpent and then gave a soft huff of approval. Kalia didn't flinch. Robb knelt down, slowly extending a hand. Kalia slid forward and rested his head just beneath Robb's palm. "His, soft," Robb breathed. "I thought he'd feel like a rock." Sansa tiptoed into Arthur's room, her curiosity battling with well-practiced caution. She peeked over the edge of the doorway, hands clutching her skirt as her eyes landed on the long, dark coils stretched across the floor. Sansa froze as Kalia lifted his head. Sansa squealed like she'd stepped on a frog, spun on her heel, and bolted down the hall in a flurry of footsteps, calling out, "Mother!" It's in his room. Arthur tilted his head calmly. He lives here. John giggled behind his hand. Rob looked like he wasn't sure whether to chase after Sansa or offer Kalia a snack. Samwell whispered reverently, "She's fast." Moments later, Arya toddled in after her, her little feet thumping unevenly against the stone floor. She paused in the doorway and spotted the serpent stretched across the rug. "SSSSSS," she cried happily, clapping her hands. Kalia blinked at her, tongue flicking once. Arya waddled forward and plopped onto the rug beside Arthur, completely fearless. Padfoot gave a quiet groan, scooting closer like a guardian ready to intervene, but Kalia remained still and watchful. "She likes him," Rob whispered. Arya giggled and reached out to pat the serpent's scales. Jon's eyes widened, but Kalia didn't flinch. Instead, the snake shifted gently, curling his tail around her tiny feet like a soft ribbon. Arthur looked at his youngest sister with a quiet smile. "You're not afraid of anything?" Arya looked up. "Snake funny." Ashura and Ned stepped into Arthur's room, their boots echoing softly against the stone. Kalia lay fully stretched across the stone floor, his massive 13-foot body coiled in wide arcs from wall to bedpost, tail lazily brushing against the far corner. Sleek black-green scales shimmered in the firelight, and his golden eyes blinked with slow, deliberate calm. Arya was nestled beside one of the coils, legs tucked underneath her, giggling softly as she tapped the serpent's side with her fingers. Jon, Rob, and Samwell stood clustered near the foot of the bed, still wide-eyed, speaking only in hushed tones. Padfoot lay curled nearby, head on his paws, unconcerned. Ashura stopped in her tracks, eyes going wide. Ned muttered, "Seven hells." "He's bigger than I imagined," Ashura said, stepping forward cautiously. Arthur looked up from where he sat cross-legged near the hearth, Kalia's head resting comfortably beside his shoulder. "He likes it here," he said simply. Ashura lowered herself into a crouch, her gaze locked on Kalia's unmoving eyes. "Does he bite?" "Not unless someone's mean," Arthur replied. "Or lies." Arya let out a happy squeal and hugged one of the loops of tail before crawling up into her father's lap. Rob leaned closer, eyes wide, while Jon kept a protective hand on Samwell's shoulder. He rubbed his temple. "We're going to have to warn the visiting lords," he said grimly. "And their families. Especially the ones with young children." Ashura arched a brow. "You think a warning's enough?" "Better than a heart attack at dinner," Ned replied, glancing toward the serpent as it adjusted one long coil near the bedpost. "Imagine one of the lords walking in and seeing that curled under the table." Jon stifled a giggle. Padfoot gave a low, amused huff. "And the servants," Ned continued. "They'll need to know when he's in the halls. Last thing we need is someone dropping a tray of roast goose when they see him and think he's going to eat them." "I'll tell the cooks myself," Ashura murmured. "He likes roast goose," Arthur offered helpfully. Ned gave his son a long look. "Then let's not let him near the kitchens." Rob leaned forward, still watching the serpent in awe. "What if Kalia just wants to watch people eat?" Samwell paled. "What if he wants to eat people when they're eating?" Arya giggled again. Ned exhaled slowly. "I swear," he muttered, "I'm going to kick Benjen's rear the next time I see him. Could have at least warned us before we got here, not after the bloody snakes moved in." Ashura, arms crossed, gave a half smile. "He did say it was big." "That was the extent of the warning." Ned glanced at her with a dry look. "So was the bloody wall." "This is bigger." Arthur sat cross-legged on the rug, calmly feeding Kalia bits of dried fish from a small dish. "Mayra told me something interesting," he said, as if he hadn't just heard his father threaten violence against his uncle. Ned raised an eyebrow. "This ought to be good." Arthur patted one of the quills. "She said Kalia's kind eats lizard lions." Jon's eyes went wide. "Really?" Rob leaned forward, whispering to Samwell, "Are lizard lions real?" Samwell nodded, then paused. "I think so. I hope not." "Like, eats them whole?" Sansa asked from behind Ashura. Arthur nodded solemnly. "From the swamp. They hunt them there. Kalia's the biggest she's seen." Ned stared at the serpent, then looked at his son. "So not only do we have a massive snake living with us, it also eats the things other people are scared of." Arthur smiled. He keeps me safe. Ashura tapped her chin. If he eats lizard lions, he'd probably eat bears too. Ned groaned, already bracing for the next time a visiting lord walks straight into a hallway and finds a 13-foot marsh predator lounging by a brazier. Arthur gave Kalia an affectionate pat as the serpent lazily coiled beside the hearth, his long body curling and uncurling like a ribbon of shadow. The boys had begun laying out a blanket fort near the wall, while Arya toddled around with a wooden wolf tucked under her arm, occasionally stopping to babble at the great snake. Padfoot watched from under the bed, tail twitching thoughtfully. He can hunt in the Godswood, Arthur said matter-of-factly, placing a small bowl of dried fish scraps on the floor. Mayra said it's big enough for him to find food on his own. Rabbits. Grouse. Maybe even a fox. And what happens, he asked, voice calm but edged, if one of the hounds from the kennels goes missing, or old Lewin's cat disappears off the battlements? Arthur paused. If Kalia eats someone's pet, Ned continued, you will be the one in trouble. Not the snake. Not the servants. You. Ashura, seated on the bench near the window, didn't argue. You need to take responsibility, Arthur, she said gently. Kalia might be calm now, but instincts are instincts. I'll watch him, Arthur said quickly. He listens to me. Mostly. Mostly. Ned echoed, rubbing his temple. Samuel leaned forward. Can he catch birds? John nodded eagerly. What about squirrels? Arya held up her wooden wolf. He won't eat Woody, right? Kalia blinked slowly, tongue flicking as if in amusement. Arthur smiled at his little sister. He wouldn't touch your wolf. Or Padfoot. Or any of the dogs, I promise. Ashura gave a quiet sigh. We'll see how long that promise holds once he starts slithering through the apple orchard. Ned turned to leave, calling over his shoulder, tell Maester Lewin to start keeping track of the ravens. If one goes missing, I'll know where to look. Arthur gave Kalia a gentle scratch under the chin. The hearth was burning low, its glow casting warm golden light across the stone walls of Ned and Ashura's chamber. Outside, snow whispered against the shutters. Within, quiet had settled, soft breathing, a crackling fire, and the steady rhythm of heartbeats beneath layers of fur. Ashura lay tucked against Ned's chest, fingers gently curled into the linen of his undershirt. Her head rose and fell with each breath he took, warm and steady beneath her cheek. She spoke quietly, the words drifting through the hush. When Mayra said Arthur was ready to bond, I thought she meant a bird. Maybe a marsh cat, something with a little elegance. Ned exhaled through his nose, eyes tracing the flames. Not a serpent longer than our dining hall. Ashura smirked. Certainly not one that could swallow our son without chewing. He let out a soft grunt, somewhere between a laugh and a groan. Benjen sent that letter far too late. If I'd known a 13-foot snake was hitching a ride home with Arthur, I might have met them at the gates with a spear. You'd never have used it, Ashura murmured. No, Ned admitted. Just waved it around dramatically. She chuckled and shifted against him, wrapping an arm over his chest. I still keep thinking about the way Arthur looked at him, she whispered. Not afraid. Not cautious. Just, sure. That's what frightened me most, Ned said, running a hand lightly down her back. The certainty. Is it wrong that I'm proud? Ashura whispered. No, he said. But I'll need a good ale before I can start explaining it to our bannerman. Ashura smiled, eyes closing as the fire dipped into embers. Let's start with warning the servants. Before Kalia finds his way into the laundry. Ned shifted beneath the furs, brushing a few loose strands of silver from Ashura's face. Her eyes were half-lidded, the tired warmth of the day still lingering in her body, folded against his. He kissed her, slow and deep, like a wordless promise. Ashura laughed into the kiss, pulling back just enough to murmur against his lips, "Careful, my lord, if we keep this up, there'll be another little Stark scrambling through the halls come next year." Ned tilted his head, a smile ghosting at the edge of his mouth. He leaned in again, brushing his lips against the curve of her ear. And what, he whispered, would be so bad about that? Ashura let out a soft, breathy laugh, fingers curling into the collar of his tunic. You just want an army to keep pace with Arthur's creature collection. I want a child, he said quietly. One born into peace, warmth and something better. She didn't reply immediately, only shifted closer and kissed him back. The next morning at Winterfell Keep, the air carried the scent of crisp frost and roasted meats, as breakfast trays were carted into the great hall with quiet efficiency. Snow still clung to the windowsills, and the younger children had gathered near one long table. Samwell, Arya, Robb, and Jon stood in a line like four tiny sentries, frozen in a peculiar mixture of horror and awe. On the table before them, Kalia slowly wrapped a coil around the leg of a wooden stool and unhinged his jaw. The roasted bird on the plate, steaming, browned, and stuffed with herbs, had barely cooled before Kalia swallowed it whole. One slow, deliberate motion, like a rope pulling down a curtain, and it was gone. Bones, stuffing, skin, everything. Arya clapped her hands. He ate the whole bird. Samwell's mouth was hanging open. No chewing. No. Anything. Robb leaned just slightly closer. Did the plate just rattle? Jon's eyes never left the serpent. He's bigger in the morning. The servant who had brought the tray had retreated halfway across the hall the moment Kalia approached, muttering something about unnatural appetites and no way am I standing near that. She peeked from behind a pillar now, eyeing the empty dish like it might burst into flames. Kalia shifted his coils, satisfied and languid, then flicked his tongue at the children with what looked like approval. Arya giggled and offered him her leftover bacon strip. He blinked at her, politely declined with a turn of his head, and slithered toward the hearth with lazy grace. Samwell whispered, "Do snakes get full?" "Guess we'll find out when he tries eating a boar," Robb muttered. Jon turned to Arthur, just now entering, boots trailing fresh snow. "Does he always eat like that?" Arthur smiled, brushing frost from his cloak. "Only when he's happy." Arya beamed. "Then he's very very happy." The laughter and morning chatter in the hall dimmed as the heavy oak doors swung open with a thud. Maester Lewin entered in a rush, robes askew, cheeks flushed from cold and urgency. He carried a scroll clutched tightly in one hand, the seal broken, the parchment creased from haste. Ned looked up from the long table, brows drawing together as his chair scraped quietly against the stone. The children paused mid-bite, eyes wide at the rare sight of the usually composed Maester looking entirely undone. "Maester?" Ashura asked, standing beside Ned. Lewin stopped just short of the table, breath coming quick. "Lord Stark, forgive the intrusion, but there's something you must hear." Ned stood fully now, his tone sharpening. "Go on." "The Ironborn," Lewin said, voice low but steady. "They've attacked Lannisport." Jon gasped. Samwell dropped his spoon. Lewin continued, "The fleet in the harbor was burned and the piers set ablaze. Reports claim Euron Greyjoy led the assault. He sailed in by night, under cloud cover. It was a surprise. A massacre." Ashura's expression turned grim. "The Western Fleet." "Gone," Lewin said simply. "And King Robert, he's calling the banners." Silence gripped the hall. Ned's jaw tightened. "When?" "Immediately," Lewin replied. "Messengers have been sent to the major lords. War councils are forming. The king writes for Riverrun to gather forces. He expects you in 10 days' time." Robb whispered, "Does that mean fighting?" Arya clutched Arthur's sleeve. Even Kalia stirred slightly from his coil near the hearth, tongue flicking in the tension. Ned placed a steady hand on the table. "We'll begin preparations today. Winterfell will answer the call." Ned nodded once, then turned to Lewin. "Summon Benjen. I'll need every raven ready to call the bannerman." The sky was muted pewter, heavy with thick clouds that hung low over the rising hills. Winterfell's courtyard buzzed with the last sounds of war-ready clatter, hooves against stone, cloaks tugged against wind, banners of grey and white fluttering as the host formed ranks. Arthur stood near the main gate, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak 2 sizes too large, flanked by his siblings. Ashura stood behind them, one hand resting gently on his shoulder, her posture still and strong as Ned and Benjen rode at the front of their gathered bannermen, heading west to answer the king's summons. The column stretched far, Karstarks, Mormonts, Umbers, tall and grim men carrying spears and shields, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Robb clutched Jon's arm, eyes round as the riders passed. Samwell whispered beneath his breath, counting the horses. Arya clapped once when Padfoot barked at the procession, though even her cheer had grown quiet. Arthur didn't speak. He watched until the last riders disappeared over the far hill where snow gave way to mist. "They are gone," Sansa whispered, her voice just a thread of breath. Ashura tightened her grip on Arthur's shoulder, leaning down to press a quiet kiss to his hair. Beside them, Daisy stood stiffly, her armor exchanged for layered wool, her brow furrowed deeper than any storm cloud. She stared after Benjen with a mix of pride and frustration. Ashura turned gently. "You'll have more than enough work here, Daisy." "I know," Daisy murmured, one hand drifting down to rest against her stomach. "He wanted me to stay. Said Queen's crown wouldn't be ready until the end of all this." Ashura gave a soft smile. "It won't be easy. But that child will have a strong mother. And a stubborn father." Daisy chuckled, though it wavered. "He said he'll be back before I show. I said I'd chase him to Riverrun if he broke that promise." Arthur finally looked up. "Will the baby be like Uncle Benjen?" Daisy smiled properly now, gaze softening. "Let's hope it's got his loyalty. And not his appetite." Slowly the group split off, Ashura guiding Arya to her room as Robb, Jon and Sansa went to play, Daisy leading Samwell off to the side. Arthur entered his room and sat at his desk, the fire behind him casting soft, flickering light across the room. Padfoot curled in a shaggy ball near the door, ears twitching occasionally, while Kaylee rested beside the hearth, golden eyes half-lidded in post-breakfast contentment as Arthur opened the relationship tab in the interface. Family bond status, Arthur Stark. Ashura, mother. 97. Ned, father. 92. Samwell, brother. 95. Jon, brother. 88. Robb, brother. 84. Sansa, sister. 78. Arya, sister. 100. Benjen, uncle. 91. Daisy, aunt. 87. Arthur turned to the skill tab next. Skill area. Progress level. Water magic. 21. Swordsmanship. 3. Archery, bow. 2. Daggers. 5. Blocking and defense. 6. Stealth. 41. Reading and writing. 52. Tracking. 25. Hunting. 18. Languages. 46. Satisfied, Arthur clicked out of the interface. The moons passed with the quiet urgency only wartime could bring. Snow piled high against the walls of Winterfell. The ravens came steadily, inked letters in Ned's hand and stamped updates from Riverrun and Lannisport. Slowly, the tide of war began to turn. The Ironborn were losing ground. The Crown's forces had taken back the piers, and what remained of Euron's fleet scattered like ash into wind. Arthur read the messages when they were shared aloud, his gaze steady, lips pressed into thought. He didn't speak much about the war, but he listened, always listening. Meanwhile, Winterfell swelled with quieter changes. Daisy had been muttering curses since the middle of the second moon. Her belly had begun to swell noticeably, and every kick was matched by the fire in her voice. "He promised he'd be back before I was showing," she grumbled, shoving a tray aside during breakfast. "If I so much as get a whiff of his location, I'll ride there myself and smack him with his own damn sword." "You'll need 3 stable boys just to lift you onto the saddle," Mayra had remarked dryly, earning a glare sharp enough to cut ice. Still, Ashura had smiled quietly as she wrapped a hand over her own belly, no longer hiding the change in her body, no longer pretending it wasn't there. It was the 8th moon since Ned and Benjen had ridden out beneath banners of wolf and ice, vanishing over the hills with war in their wake. The silence left in their absence had stretched long and low, but it broke without warning one frigid night when the howl of winter winds was joined by something far louder. Daisy's cries rang through the stone halls like thunder clapping inside a mountain. Arthur had just returned from the Godswood when the echo reached him, raw, fierce, and unmistakable. Samwell froze beside him mid-step. Jon dropped the kindling he'd been carrying. Robb's eyes widened. Arya asked, "Is someone fighting?" "No," Mayra said from the stairwell, her voice firm and calm, her hands gently guiding the children toward the solar. "No fighting. Just Daisy's battle is a different kind. She's having the baby. John asked. Mayra gave him a slow nod. She is. Ashura had been at Daisy's side since the early hours, her own movements slower now, belly swelling far more noticeable. She moved with grace still, if less speed, with hands sure and soothing. Maester Lewin hovered nearby, arms full of linens, brows drawn tight. She's strong, Ashura murmured to him between contractions. She'll see it through. She's stubborn, Lewin replied. A true Mormont. But the babe's coming fast, and yours, Lady Stark, is not far behind. I'd wager days. A week, at most. Ashura let out a long breath and pressed a cool cloth to Daisy's brow. No talk of wagers. Just preparation, Lewin said, tucking the blankets into place. The halls will be louder soon. The cries ended at midnight. A burst of sound from the west corridor, then laughter. Not loud, but exhausted. And over it, Ashura's voice, clear and proud. She's here. Arthur stood before Mayra even opened the door. A girl, he asked. Mayra nodded. They all followed quietly to the chamber, but stood just outside the threshold, watching through the open doorway. Daisy lay beneath fresh linens, face flushed and damp, arms curled around a tiny bundle swaddled in pale blue. Ashura sat beside her, one hand still resting on her own belly, gaze glowing with quiet pride. She's beautiful, Ashura whispered. She's fierce, Daisy croaked, voice raspy but strong. And stubborn. Nearly took 2 moons off my life before arriving. Maester Lewin busied himself with ink and cloth, nodding approvingly. Arthur stepped closer, silent and wide-eyed. Daisy looked up at him, then down at the bundle she cradled, her smile slow but unshaken. Her name is Lyra, she said softly. It happened on a quiet morning, with snow tumbling in soft flakes across the courtyard and the hearths lit early for warmth. The castle had just begun to settle into rhythm again, cribs built, Lyra sleeping soundly, and ravens quiet for the first time in days, when Ashura's breath caught mid-step in the solar. Mayra noticed first, cutting off her sentence and guiding her to the nearest cushioned chair. Daisy was already moving from the nursery, wrapped in a cloak, her hair braided high and her sleeves rolled up with muscle memory. Ashura gave a small, wincing breath and gripped Mayra's arm. It's time, she murmured. No doubt, Mayra said with calm finality. Go. I'll keep the children. Daisy nodded and swept toward her, already calling down the corridor for Lewin and warming water. Arthur had been helping Samwell sort books in the corner when Mayra pressed a hand to his shoulder. Stay close, but out of the way, she said gently. You can hear the bells when it's done. Arya blinked. Is Mama having her baby now? Babies, Mayra corrected with a smirk. If the signs hold true. John leaned toward the window as if that might help. Rob turned toward the door but didn't move. Arthur said nothing, just nodded and took Arya's hand. Upstairs, the birthing chamber grew warm and bright with firelight, blankets laid out and fresh linens passed from hand to hand. Ashura was calm, but her voice trembled once as Lewin checked her pulse. Daisy knelt beside her with practiced grace, her own belly still tender but her hands steady. I'll be here the whole time, she whispered. Even if it takes a week. Even if I have to drag your stubborn Stark husband back from the field to name them. Ashura laughed then winced again. Maester Lewin moved with brisk efficiency, his tone calm despite the growing urgency. They are close, he murmured. And your pace is exactly as I predicted, my lady. Any hour now. Ashura gave him a half-hearted glare, then let out a low breath and leaned into the next contraction. Daisy, seated beside her, brushed the damp hair back from her temple. You and Ned have no business being this competitive, Daisy muttered with a wry smile. If Benjen and I want to keep up, we're behind by several babies. Ashura managed a chuckle, then winced sharply, gripping the bed frame. If I wasn't in labor right now, she gasped, I'd suggest you both start when they get back. Daisy laughed. Ashura squeezed her hand again, harder now. Her body trembled with effort, breath hitching as Lewin leaned forward with a nod. It's nearly time. Outside the chamber, Winterfell kept its hush. Mayra watched over the children near the solar, telling Arya to stop pacing and assuring John that no, they couldn't peek in. Arthur sat by the hearth, journal untouched beside him, his focus tethered to something deeper, a sense, a shift, like water folding around stone. Another cry rang from the chamber. Arthur closed his eyes. The sun had dipped low behind Winterfell's stone towers, casting long shadows across the courtyard, and as the hour of the bat began. Inside, the hearth glowed warm. Ashura lay wrapped in fresh linens, her black hair damp, cheeks flushed with exertion and joy. Her violet eyes shimmered with tears as the first cry came like music cutting through dusk. A small, fierce voice, loud, insistent, alive. Daisy held up the swaddled bundle with gentle hands. "A girl," she announced. Ashura reached for the babe with trembling fingers, gathering her close. The child nestled against her instantly, the faintest dusting of brown-black hair visible beneath the blanket. Her eyes, dark gray, blinked once and stared upward. "Elia," Ashura whispered, her voice ragged but firm. "Elia Stark." The name echoed softly off the stone walls, like a promise stitched into snow. Moments passed, then another wave of pain gripped Ashura, and Lewin was ready before she even said a word. The second cry followed quickly afterwards. Ashura's breath caught as Daisy gently passed her the second bundle, a boy, his skin ruddy from the cold, tufts of dark brown hair already damp with warmth, small fists curled like pine cones. Ashura cradled him to her chest, tears slipping freely now. "Artos," she said, brushing her lips across his brow. "Artos Stark." He blinked, slow, deliberate, and nestled against her heartbeat. Lewin stood back and nodded, both healthy, full Stark coloring and features, no mistaking it. The great gates groaned open with a familiar rumble, echoing like a heartbeat in the chill. After 8 long moons, the banners of Stark returned home. Ned rode at the front, Benjen just behind him, both worn but resolute. Their armor carried the grime of hard marches and the faded scent of fire. The war was over, Euron Greyjoy defeated, his fleet scattered to the tide, and the ravens bearing that victory had reached Winterfell barely a day after the twins were born. The courtyard had filled quickly with guards and servants, the ethic with quiet celebration and long-awaited relief. But Ned wasn't listening to the murmurs. His eyes scanned the crowd instinctively, until they landed on her. Ashura stood near the gatehouse wrapped in a thick black cloak, violet eyes shimmering in the winter light. In her arms rested 2 small bundles, each wrapped in soft wolf-grey wool. Beside her, Daisy cradled a single swaddled infant of her own, posture proud despite exhaustion. Benjen's mouth fell open as he dropped from his saddle, gaze fixed on Lyra with a stunned, wordless smile. Daisy didn't wait, she marched forward and shoved the baby toward him with a teasing glare. 8 moons late, she snapped. "But she doesn't hold it against you." "I do." Benjen took the baby reverently, stunned silent. Ned was slower to dismount, blinking at Ashura as if trying to decipher what he saw. She stepped forward quietly and lifted the bundles just enough for him to see the sleeping faces, Elia, dark lashes brushing her cheeks, and Artos, one fist curled beneath his chin. Ned froze. "Twins." Ashura's lips curved into a small, tired smile, her dark hair drifting softly around her cheeks in the winter breeze. She met Ned's gaze with quiet certainty, the 2 small bundles nestled securely in her arms. He looked from her face to the sleeping children, stunned into stillness. A girl, her tiny fingers curled against the blanket. A boy, blinking once before nestling deeper into his mother's arms. Ashura gave a quiet smile, eyes shining. "This is Elia," she said gently, nodding toward the girl. "And Artos." Ned's breath hitched as he reached out, touching each child with reverent, battle-worn fingers. "Elia and Artos," he echoed. Ashura leaned into him, forehead brushing his shoulder. "I've missed you." The great yawn boomed out above the bustle like a drumbeat, voice rough with joy and ale thirst. "This calls for a feast, damn it. The war's done, babe's born, and Benjen Stark still has his teeth." He stomped over and slapped Benjen hard on the shoulder, nearly sending him sideways with the force of it. "That little bear wife of yours still hasn't turned you into a bard, though I hear you've been swinging more than blades lately." Benjen grunted but was smiling, adjusting his cloak, and that's when Arthur's eyes caught it. The sword. A long red blade, worn with care. Its polished steel shimmered with a crimson hue along the fuller, the grip black leather bound with stark silver, and the pommel carved into a silent wolf's head. Arthur blinked, leaning forward from where he stood beside Ashura. Daisy, surrounded now by her mother and sister, both tall, salt-fierce northern women with matching braids and broad smiles, had just passed Lyra into her mother's arms. Her sister fussed over the blankets and the babe's cheeks, Daisy watching them with something between pride and exasperation. Benjen turned toward her, catching her eye and drawing the sword from his hip just enough for the red glint to shimmer in the pale light. "That's Red Rain," he said simply. Daisy's brows lifted. "You stole Red Rain." "I claimed it in duel," Benjen replied with a smile sharp as frostbite. The drum lord dropped it. "I didn't." Gratian let out a roar of approval. "A Stark with a prize worth singing about. You'll tell us everything, every damned word, tonight over meat and mead." Ashura's arms tightened gently around the bundled twins as her violet gaze swept past Ned's shoulders toward the edge of the caravan. The yard buzzed with cheer, bannermen clapping backs, children darting between snow piles, but just behind Ned stood a boy whose stillness didn't match the warmth of the homecoming. He couldn't have been much older than Rob. Tall for his age, wiry with wind-blown hair the color of wet sand, and a mouth drawn tight in a line too stern for someone so young. His eyes didn't wander in wonder or pride, they stared at the ground like he wished the stone would swallow him whole. Ashura's brows knit softly. "Who's the boy?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. Ned turned, followed her gaze, and sighed through his nose. "Theon Greyjoy," he muttered. "Balon's youngest son. He'll be warded here, until his father sees sense or dies trying not to." Ashura tilted her head. "A hostage." "A ward," Ned corrected gently. "In name." Robert insisted. He turned toward the boy briefly. Ashura nodded slowly, her gaze still on the boy as he shifted awkwardly, not yet stepping forward. The snow curled around his boots. He didn't meet her eyes. Daisy came to stand beside her, Lyra nestled against her shoulder, watching. "He looks like he hasn't slept in a fortnight." "Likely hasn't," Ned said, seeing Arthur watch the boy closely. The great hall of Winterfell roared with laughter, the hearths blazing high as meat sizzled and horns sloshed with mead. The return of the Starks, the birth of 3 children, and the end of the war had lit the castle like a beacon. Every bannerman, steward, and snow-worn soul was drinking to something, and then drinking again. Benjen was halfway through his 6th horn of strong black beer when the Gratian thumped the table with a fist like a battering ram. "Enough whispers, you Stark wolf. Tell us how you got the damned sword." A cheer rose. Benjen, already flushed, blinked slowly as he set his horn down, swaying slightly where he sat. He patted the hilt of Red Rain at his side, which gleamed dully in the firelight, like blood that never cooled. "Oh gods," he muttered. "You want the tale?" He hiccuped. "Fine. But if I slur, blame the wine." Gratian howled in triumph and slammed a fresh horn in front of him. "Speak, sir. Before you forget which end of the blade's the sharp one." Benjen stood, or tried to, managing only a half rise before leaning heavily on the table. "Drum," he began, finger pointed vaguely. "Not the old one. The ugly one." Thought himself very clever. Brought 2 blades. One was Red Rain. The crowd quieted in anticipation. Ned, seated beside Ashura with Elia nestled against his chest, arched a brow but said nothing. Benjen gestured grandly. "We dueled on the pier." He swung fast. I ducked faster. He paused, blinking. Or maybe he tripped. One of those. Laughter rang out. Daisy smirked and folded her arms. "He wanted me dead," Benjen continued, slurring a little more now. "I wanted his sword. Only one of us left the beach with what he came for." Someone shouted, "Did you kill him?" Benjen blinked, swaying slightly. His cheeks were flushed, and he pointed to the crimson blade. "I cut his head off," Benjen announced loudly, holding up a finger as if presenting undeniable truth. The whole gasped and leaned closer. Then he blinked again. Slower this time. "Or maybe I kicked him," he added, voice dragging a little. "Off the deck and into the sea." "Hard to say, really. It was dark." The Gratian bellowed, nearly choking on his mead. "Ha! So either you beheaded a drum or gave him a good swim." "Either way," Benjen said, raising his drink like a scepter, "I got the sword." Daisy shook her head from across the table, cradling Lyra with one arm, the other planted firmly on her hip. Benjen waved dramatically at no one in particular. "He swung once, I swung twice." Then someone flew. Could have been him. Could have been his hat. I do remember the splash. Laughter rang off the walls. Plates clattered. Rob and John leaned forward, completely enthralled, while Arya whispered to Arthur, maybe he got ate by a sea dragon. Someone from the far end of the hall, voice already hazy with drink, called out, what are you naming it then, Benjen? The blade's yours now. Benjen blinked slowly, looked up, and squinted around like he wasn't sure who spoke, but heard the question anyway. Then, with a sudden surge of cheer and defiance, he threw both arms in the air and roared, Bloodwatch. That's what it is. The hall erupted, cheers, clanking mugs, even a meat trencher hitting the floor in triumph. The great yawn let out a bellow so loud it startled two ravens perched near the windows. Benjen nodded to no one in particular, swaying. Bloodwatch. Watching blood. Guarding blood. Spilling blood. Then he slapped the hilt fondly as if it were a faithful hound and declared, thank you all. You're the best damn drinkers in the north. And then, with zero warning, he collapsed backward off the bench, hit the stone with a thud, and dissolved into a fit of drunken laughter that echoed under the tables. Daisy didn't flinch. She watched him for a long moment, rocking Lyra gently with one hand and pinching the bridge of her nose with the other. Gone for over 9 moons of war, she muttered. Comes home, names a sword, topples like a sack of boiled turnips. Ashura smirked as she settled Elia deeper into Ned's arms. At least he didn't name it something ridiculous. Arthur sat quietly, watching his uncle roll on the flagstones, laughing like a man who had cheated death one duel too many. Daisy gave the spectacle one last glance before turning and gesturing sharply with her free hand. Right, come on. All of you. If you stay any longer you'll be quoting your uncle in your sleep. Ashura followed with a soft chuckle, adjusting Elia's blanket as the newborn curled against her chest. Artos, tucked into the sling against her side, made a sleepy grunt in reply. Arya pouted as she was ushered forward. But he was about to arm wrestle a boar. That's not a boar, Samwell mumbled. That's a meat trencher. Close enough, Arya replied. You can see him make a fool of himself again tomorrow, Ashura said gently, ushering the children toward the stairs. Her violet eyes sparkled with that mixture of exhaustion and patience reserved only for mothers with newborns and a drunken good brother. Chapter 7, 290 AC. Chapter text. The training yard echoed with wood smacking against each other and crunching snow. John stood in a half-guard stance, breath misting in the cold air, eyes sharp beneath a mop of dark curls. Arthur circled him slowly, wooden blade gripped in gloved hands, Padfoot watching from the snowbank with a faint huff of amusement. The bout began with a quick feint from Arthur. John dodged, narrow shoulders twisting just enough to avoid the strike, but the second swing clipped his hip, sending him skidding slightly. Interface update. Swordsmanship, 3-4. Progress, plus 12 XP. Arthur grinned. John gritted his teeth and charged, blade coming low. Arthur pivoted, raising his arm in a quick block. Interface update. Blocking, 6.2. Endurance, 4.1. The impact rang up Arthur's arm, but he held firm. John recovered, darting forward with a sharper jab. Arthur dodged, a sidestep, just barely. Interface update. Dodging, 3.6, 3.8. Endurance, 4.1, 4.2. His breath caught as the chill bit deeper, boots sliding on frosted stone. John swung again, faster this time. Arthur parried, twice, then swept John's legs with a quick, twisting motion that sent his brother thudding into the snow. Interface update. Swordsmanship, 4.3. Blocking, 6.2, 6.5. Endurance, 4.2, 4.3. Arthur offered a hand. John took it, scowling, but pulled himself up with a grin. You're getting faster. He rolled his shoulder, tapped the wooden blade once against his palm, and smiled. Again. Again, Arthur said, steadying his stance. John squared his shoulders, jaw tight with determination. He was nearly 7 now, faster, more focused, and less likely to hesitate. Roderick's voice cut through the silence, gravel-worn and deliberate. Blades up. Feet shoulder width. Don't just swing, Read the wind between you. Arthur nodded, already stepping into rhythm. Sparring interface active. Arthur Stark. Swordsmanship, 4.34.6. Dodging, 3.84.0. Blocking, 6.56.8. Endurance, 4.34.4. The two boys clashed, wooden blades clapping with sharp rhythm. Jon ducked low beneath a sweeping strike, countered with a quick jab to Arthur's shoulder. Arthur twisted, parried, and dropped into a roll, coming up behind Jon with a sharp smack across the thigh. Jon grunted and spun, blade raised. Arthur blocked high, absorbed the force, stepped back. Interface update. Endurance, 4.44.5. Swordsmanship, plus 10 XP. Dodging, plus 6 XP. Roderick gave a slow nod. Good form, both of you. Jon, less weight on your front foot. Arthur, don't dance too wide, your heels lose traction. Padfoot let out a low bark from the sidelines, tail flicking in approval. Kalia remained tucked beneath the nearby bench, tongue flicking lazily, observing like a silent judge. The spar ended with Jon lunging, Arthur dodging sideways, sweeping low and tapping the back of Jon's knees with his blade. Jon collapsed into the snow, breathing hard, and laughed. Arthur offered his hand again. Roderick stepped forward, giving a firm nod. You're both ahead of your years. Arthur's footwork is becoming precise, but Jon, your timing's sharper than last week. Keep this pace, and by the first thaw, you'll be sparring steel with confidence. Arthur helped Jon up, brushing snow from his tunic. The boys looked at each other, winded but proud. Sir Roderick watched the boys as they finished their bout, hands still resting on the pommel of his cane sword, breath clouding faintly in the cold. He stepped forward with quiet authority and a nod of approval. That'll do, lads, he said gruffly. Training's done for now. You've earned a hot meal and a dry cloak. Arthur exhaled slowly, lowering his wooden sword with a flick. Jon wiped sweat from his brow with the edge of his sleeve, cheeks flushed red from effort and frost. Roderick gestured toward the gear rack near the wall. Put the weapons and shields away properly. No tossing. If I find one blade leaning like it's drunk, you'll be oiling every haft in the yard come sundown. Yes, Sir Roderick, Arthur said with a small grin, already heading toward the rack. Jon followed, cradling his practice shield under his arm, boots crunching lightly against the stone. They moved in comfortable silence, each slotting their gear back into place with practiced hands. Arthur ran a palm down the grip of his sword once more before setting it upright, checking the wrap for any wear. Jon tapped his practice blade into its brace, nudging it firmly to align with the others. He's watching, he whispered with a smirk. Arthur glanced back. Roderick was indeed watching, arms folded, eye sharp, but there was approval in his gaze, buried beneath his usual frown. Arthur gave a subtle nod. Let's make it neat. They finished the task in near-perfect symmetry. Sword. Shield. Helm. Rack reset. Roderick turned away with a satisfied grunt, already heading back toward the keep. Padfoot rose from his post beside the bench and shook off the snow like he'd been waiting for just this moment. Arthur and Jon stepped out of the training yard, the crunch of snow underfoot steady between them. Their cloaks were damp with sweat and frost, steam still curling off their shoulders as their bodies cooled from the spar. Padfoot trotted ahead in loose, satisfied loops, tongue lolling from exertion. Jon's voice broke the silence, soft and thoughtful. Do you think they'll be back soon? Arthur glanced over, the wind tugging at the corner of his cloak. It's been nearly a moon. Jon nodded, kicking at a frozen tuft of hay. I miss him. And Samwell. He always made dinner louder. He always made everything louder, Arthur replied dryly. Especially when he's trying to tell Padfoot not to steal his boots. Jon smirked, but his brows were drawn tight. I thought it'd be only a few keeps. A week, maybe two. Arthur's pace slowed. Father wanted Samwell to see all the Bannermen. Not just their halls, but their people. Their lands. Their winters. Because he's the heir, Jon murmured. Arthur nodded. He needs to know what he's protecting. Not just how to fight for it. They passed under one of the stone arches leading toward the keep, snow dropping in slow clumps from the overhang. Behind them, Padfoot let out a low chuff and sprinted ahead toward the kitchens with renewed purpose. John grinned. He's chasing something. Arthur glanced down the hall, eyes thoughtful. Hopefully not a raven. Arthur and John had barely turned toward the keep when a whirlwind of muddy boots and wild energy barreled into view. Arya! John gasped as their younger sister launched herself at his side, tugging his sleeve with the force of a charging pony. You promised, after sparring with Arthur, you said you'd spar with me. Come on. John glanced at Arthur, sheepish but resigned. Arthur just smiled and gave a short nod. Arya didn't wait for permission, she was already dragging John toward the cleared patch of snow by the kennel gate, boots slipping, braid bouncing, her oversized cloak flapping like a banner in a storm. Arthur leaned against the low wall, watching them go. Padfoot settled beside him with a soft thump, ears perked in faint amusement. Arya had been fierce from the moment she was born. Even now, not quite 4 years old, she'd rather dive into a snowbank than curtsy. Ashura had tried everything, lace, ribbons, lessons in embroidery, but Arya met it all with stubborn defiance. She chased sparrows, climbed stable rafters, and had once thrown her dress into the fire just to see how fast it would burn. Arthur had overheard Ned once, quiet and wry, saying to Ashura that Arya reminded him of his sister, wild and untamed as a northern wind. Arthur rested his elbows on the low stone wall as the echoes of Arya's giggled war cries faded into the distance, his gaze drifting toward the patch of sky above the eastern tower, where snow flurried gently like falling petals. He thought of Sangza. Where Arya thundered, Sangza floated. If Arya was wind and thorn, then Sangza was silk and harp strings. She was only 5, but already, her whole face lit like lantern glass whenever Ashura spoke of knights and tourneys, her eyes wide and radiant as if each tale spun by firelight were a prelude to her own story. Whenever their mother sang to them, soft songs from dawn or ballads of old heroes, Sangza would sway in time with the melody, eyes shut, hands folded like a lady in court. She'd whispered once, dreamily, one day, I'll be a princess. With a crown and a garden full of white roses. And Arthur, half smiling, had nodded, even though Padfoot had just tracked mud across the carpet and Arya was dangling upside down from a chair nearby. Sangza would rather learn embroidery than chase frogs. She practiced curtsies when she thought no one was looking. She begged Ashura to braid her hair like a noble lady's, long and gleaming, with ribbons woven through. She once cried when a petal fell off her favorite flower, convinced it had been insulted. Arthur had hugged her, bewildered but gentle. But beneath all the lace and soft dreams, there was steel too. She'd defended Arya fiercely once when a visiting boy sneered at her muddy dress, chin lifted, voice crisp, like she'd seen her mother do 100 times. Arthur brushed snow from the stone railing as he watched Arya swing her practice stick at John's knees. The chill in the air nipped at his cheeks, but he barely noticed. His mind had drifted again, this time, to Rob. Rob was only a year younger than John, not yet 6. But already he carried himself like he wore a cloak too heavy for his shoulders. Out of all the siblings, Arthur knew Rob mirrored their father most. The boy moved with purpose, stood tall when Ned entered a room, and tried to mimic his tone when speaking to servants, as if each word might shape Winterfell anew. He remembered watching Rob trail after Ned in the yard last moon, hands folded behind his back, brow furrowed with the seriousness of a maester grading parchments. Rob had been mimicking every step, the stride, the pause, even the thoughtful turn of Ned's head when listening. Ashura had intervened more than once. Arthur could still hear her voice, exasperated but affectionate, as she guided Rob away mid-lecture and toward the waiting Maester Lewin. You're not ready yet, love. You're still mastering your letters. And every time, Rob protested fiercely. I can read in the evening. Sir Roderick trains in the morning. If I wait a whole year, I'll never catch up to John. The boy hated waiting. When John sparred with Arthur, or when Samwell practiced forms with the guards, Rob would press his nose against the archway wall and mutter corrections to himself, imaginary sword in hand, posture locked tight like he'd spent days rehearsing how to look brave. Arthur had once seen him scold Padfoot for not standing at attention. The wolfhound had blinked at him, rolled over, and started snoring. Rob declared it insubordination. A soft smile tugged at Arthur's mouth. They landed, inevitably, on the smallest terrace in Winterfell. Artos and Elia Stark. Not yet one, but already rewriting the rules of mischief. Arthur could barely think about them without remembering Fred and George Weasley. Back in his old life, the twins had been firecrackers stuffed into school uniforms, uncontainable, unbothered, and always 2 steps ahead of chaos. Somehow, Arthos and Elia had matched that energy before they even learned to walk properly. The food fights were legendary. Muffins hurled like snowballs. Bowls of porridge flipped with uncanny timing. Just last week, Arthur had walked in to find Arthos hurling mashed turnips at John, while Elia cackled in rhythm, covered in honey and wearing a biscuit as a hat. Ashura had nearly fainted when she found the nursery door wide open. Somehow, they'd cracked the latch. Kalia had coiled near it once, silent and expectant, as if he knew he'd be summoned to retrieve them at any moment. Padfoot refused to help anymore. Too much pride. Too little patience. Then there was the Blackberry incident. Arthur could still hear his mother's voice, equal parts horror and amusement, when she'd entered the solar expecting sleeping babes and found Arthos on the floor, lips stained dark, surrounded by burst fruit and giggling like a madman. Elia hadn't even been in the room. She'd somehow made it into the yard. Crawled past 2 guards, slipped down 2 steps. No one had noticed, until Kalia lunged. The serpent had hissed and slapped a soldier's boot with her tail, sending him staggering away from where Elia toddled behind him. Kalia reared, coiled protectively around the baby, tongue flicking in warning at any boot that came near. The yard emptied faster than when his uncle was convinced the snake would eat him. It had been the morning after Ned and Benjen returned from the war against the Ironborn. Winterfell was still shaking off its exhaustion, the feast had drained even the Great Yon into a food coma, and the soldiers wandered the halls like bears sleepwalking toward breakfast. Benjen, however, had ended his victorious night with 3 tankards too many and a sleeping pallet borrowed from one of the guest rooms. Arthur, curious and dutiful, had crept down with Padfoot to deliver a folded cloak Ashura insisted be returned to Benjen properly. He'd opened the door slowly, only to find his uncle half buried in pelts, snoring softly with his boots still on, and ended up staring into the unwavering golden eyes of Kalia. The serpent was coiled near the fireplace, silent and motionless, tongue flicking occasionally in the torchlight. He'd slithered in hours earlier, quiet, curious, and uninvited, and decided the warmth suited him perfectly. Benjen stirred groggily. Blinked. Focused on the golden stare. Then all hell broke loose. Arthur would never forget the sound, a startled yelp, followed by a mumbled, panicked, slurred, "Ned. Arthur's bloody snake has turned." Benjen had scrambled upright, tripped over his own sword belt, and half rolled out of the blankets, pointing at Kalia with his boot like it was going to fend off the 13-foot snake. "He's sizing me up," he'd shouted. "You lot trained him. I knew he'd snap eventually." Kalia, unbothered, blinked slowly and flicked his tongue again. Padfoot gave a low groan and collapsed beside the fireplace. Arthur, standing in the doorway, had tried to explain. "He's just warming up. He's not even hungry." Benjen had squinted blearily. "Then why is he staring like he's thinking I'd make a good snack?" It took 2 guards, a mug of cold broth, and Ashura's unimpressed glare to convince Benjen he wasn't on the morning menu. Later that day, Arthur found Kalia curled peacefully beside a rug in his chambers, exuding the smug serenity of someone who had deeply enjoyed watching a grown man flee under the influence of bad wine and his own imagination. Benjen and Daisy had departed to Queen's Crown a few days after that. Benjen had adjusted his cloak as he mounted the pony beside the cart, his boots cinched tight and the edge of Bloodwatch sheathed at his hip, its crimson fuller just visible beneath the leather. Beside him, Daisy secured a thick blanket over Lyra's cradle, her braid coiled tight, her expression half proud, half impatient. The cart had been loaded with supplies from the keep, salted meats, tools for the groundsman, a parcel of ravens to be trained at the new rookery. Queen's Crown waited, perched beside the half-frozen lake east of the King's Road, a beckheap rising from restored stone and new promise. But Benjen wasn't looking at the cart. He was staring, again, at the serpent. Kalia sat coiled in the snow near the courtyard wall, tongue flicking lazily as he tracked every movement with slitted gold eyes. His massive body glistened under a thin frost coat, tail looped twice like a sigil carved in shadow. He hadn't moved, hadn't hissed, just watching. Benjen leaned toward Arthur, voice low. "He's memorizing our route." Arthur, standing beside Padfoot with arms crossed, smirked. He's staying at Winterfell. He knows things, Benjen muttered, eyes narrowing. Knows how to open doors. Knows when people are gone. He's going to slither after us halfway to the neck and eat our steward. He doesn't eat people, Arthur replied calmly. That's what he wants me to think. Daisy, now seated upright in the cart with baby Lyra snuggled against her chest, rolled her eyes toward the sky. The snake's wrapped himself around my child before she called out. If he wanted us eaten, he'd have done it during the feast, while your head was still in the bread basket. Benjen straightened, affronted. He was lurking. He was coiled, Ashura said lightly from the steps. There's a difference. Kalia flicked his tongue again, slow and silent. Benjen hesitated a moment longer, gaze locked with the serpent forward / then he muttered to himself, adjusted his sword belt, and clucked at his horse. The cart began to roll toward the eastern gate. Arthur stepped forward just long enough to rest a hand on Kalia's neck. I'll miss Lyra, he said quietly. Padfoot barked, as if offering final commentary, then trotted back toward the warm stones of the hall. His mother's friend had arrived a few days later. Ashura had embraced her old friend without a word at first. Nymaria's voice had carried warmly across the keep, I've come to help, Ashura. The man I was meant to marry died at Faircastle, and I won't chase another. My heart is for my friends, and these children now. Arthur had nodded politely during the introductions, stepping forward with Padfoot at his side. Nymaria had kissed his brow like a long-lost aunt, all softness and spice, but behind her smile, Arthur felt the unmistakable flicker of memory. Because he had seen her before, back in Starfall. During the rebellion, he and Samwell had been exploring Starfall, his aunt watching them. Samwell had passed out by their aunt as Arthur continued exploring when he saw the half-open door and went in. And froze. Inside, soft light spilled across velvet cushions and parchment stacks. Ashura and Nymaria sat curled together near the low hearth, legs tangled, shoulders pressed, laughter drifting between them like music meant only for two. Ashura's fingers were buried in Nymaria's hair, and Nymaria's head had been between his mother's legs. Arthur did not want to remember that day. Mayra and Nymaria had apparently gotten to know each other fast. He never meant to spy, not exactly. But when the door cracked open just before the hour of the wolf one day when Arthur had been practicing his warging and Nymaria stepped out into the cold hall, hair a tangled mess, tunic wrinkled and slightly misbuttoned, a bruise blooming soft purple at the side of her neck, Arthur began to realize the truth. She moved quietly but never guiltily, brushing down her sleeves with easy grace. One night, he watched her pause and smirk at Padfoot as she walked past, as if the wolfhound were in on the secret. Padfoot snorted in reply, unmoved. Arthur pieced the rest together with quiet observation and sharper instinct. Mayra never flirted with the guards. She ignored noble suitors with practiced ease. She'd never spoken of a husband. Never seemed interested in one. Never whispered about children, not even in jest. Arthur now knew why. It had all but been confirmed 2 moons after Nymaria had shown up. Arthur and Samwell had been walking side by side through one of the quieter halls of Winterfell, their boots leaving soft tracks in the fresh dusting of snow that had crept through the cracked shutters. Padfoot padded ahead, nose twitching, tail low and content. They were meant to be heading toward the rookery to see the new ravens, a promise Maester Lewin had made over supper. But halfway down the corridor, Arthur slowed. He heard voices, low, familiar, intimate, slipping out through a thick oak door to their left. A slight laugh, followed by a hush and the muted sound of shifting fabric. Arthur tensed before Samwell could register the change. "Is that Mayra?" Samwell asked, blinking up at the doorway. Arthur didn't answer. He reached out and gripped his twin's sleeve gently, guiding him away from the door and toward the side passage that looped through the old storerooms. Samwell resisted for a second, confused. "Wait, this isn't the rookery," Lewin said. Arthur shot him a glance. The kind of look that didn't invite questions. Padfoot followed without hesitation. Samwell gave a small sigh and walked quietly beside him, still glancing back over his shoulder once or twice. Arthur didn't turn. He already knew what he'd heard, Mayra's voice, unmistakable. And Nymaria's, just beneath it. Soft. Familiar. The moment Arthur stepped into the corridor near the west stairs, he saw it, a flash of red cheeks and frantic boots pounding against cold stone. Rob. Running like the wolves were at his heels. Just behind him, Ashura strode fast and focused, her cloak sweeping like storm clouds and her gaze locked on her son with regal precision. She didn't yell.